Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, as well as supporting me on Locals, Buy Me a Coffee, and Subscribestar. You can also check out my work at Locals, so definitely check out Locals. And much like last week, everybody, it looks like I have no idea where Logos is. So hopefully he jumps in. Who knows? But there's still a show to do, and we see Manoan and GF are in the stream. Hello. All right. How Dawkins got pwned, Chapter 4, The Cult of Power. Oh boy, Moldbug. What does Moldbug have in store for us today? In the previous 3 chapters, I've argued that Professor Dawkins is pwned because he's chosen quite unthinkingly to lend his literary talent to a received tradition I called Universalism, which is a non-theistic Christian sect. Some other current labels for this tradition, more or less synonymous, are progressivism, multiculturalism, liberalism, humanism, leftism, political correctness, and the like. My only excuse for minting my own term is that these other labels, since they are in common use, imply various associations which may confuse the reader. Wow, that's so generous, Moldbug. As if Moldbug gives a rat's rear end about confusing the reader. I mean, universalism confuses the reader because it means everybody gets saved. Or it means a universal scope. So, I mean, he's of course confusing us. So it's what I call Moldbug's law. He's doing the opposite of what he tells you. So if he tells you he's not trying to confuse you, he's trying to confuse you. In my humble but convinced opinion, universalism is far more important, far more dangerous, and far more anti-rational than its theistic Christian competitors, which Professor Dawkins attacks with such fury. I think he's a Galileo. He thinks he's a Galileo, Vavilov, or Darwin. But if my perspective is accurate, Professor Dawkins is more a Caccini, Lysenko, or Wilberforce. He is pwned in every sense of the word, and history will treat him in its usual harsh manner. A few librarians may remember him as a curiosity of the era. So this is something that I haven't figured out yet with Moldbug, and we'll see if reading this helps. The one area in which he's absolutely right, in which his opinion, his judgment has aged extremely well, is that within the broader umbrella of progressive politics, of which the New Atheists were a part, there were elements that would threaten to undo the very system itself, which we now colloquially would call the woke. I don't know if those... See, he's not identifying those people, though, because we know in hindsight who these people were back in 2007. They've since outed themselves. And the way that Moldbug describes his theory, he never actually gets to these people. So it's very confusing. It's very confusing, which is, again, what Moldbug is good at. He's good at confusing people. Okay. Of course, I'm just a humble blogger, and I have no control at all over history. Sometimes I write out my screeds in tiny, cramped longhand and staple them to telephone poles. You, dear reader, should treat them as if you found them that way. After all, anyone can start a blog. It is interesting how also Moldbug is continually self-deprecating himself. It's almost like, don't take me seriously. But again, it's opposite day, so he wants you to take him seriously. It's not that a lot of people do this. It's not just Moldbug. It's really annoying. It's sort of a way to... It's a CYA maneuver, right? Well, if what I say is wrong, who cares? I don't know anything. But then you get mad when people don't listen to you or respect your opinions. In my opinion, however, universalism is the dominant modern branch of Christianity on the Calvinist line, evolving from the English dissenter of Puritan tradition through Unitarian, Transcendentalist, progressive movements. Again, total BS. No historical evidence here for anything that he's saying from the Puritans to the Unitarians. This is, again, no actual historical citation. Its ancestral briar patch also includes a few sideways sprigs that are important enough to name, but whose Christian ancestry is slightly better concealed, such as Rousseauian laicism, Benthamite utilitarianism, Reformed Judaism, Comtean positivism, German idealism, Marxist scientific socialism, Sartrean existentialism, Heideggerian postmodernism, etc., etc., etc. All but the first can be traced back to the first, and Rousseau himself was the Genevan and acknowledged his political debt to Calvin's Republic. So universalism traces almost all of its mimetic DNA to this hateful little pony, this pissant heretic roasting tyrant of the lake, John Calvin, so well sketched by Stefan Zweig. Well, and again, to just continually flog this dead horse, again, the 19th century examples of and early and 20th century examples of Calvinist polities, the American South, South Africa, were not universalist at all. They had like literally enforced racial segregation. Hello, Logos.
Hey, what's up?
So Moldbug's just being stupid again with his history, so you didn't miss much yet. He's just setting it up.
Thank goodness.
Which is no reason to automatically condemn it. After all, Scarlett Johansson traces all of her DNA to chimps. Evolution can change anything. Universalism, as we know it, a la Port Huron statement, would be quite unrecognizable to any of its 16th century or 17th century ancestors. It would shock the living daylights out of most 18th or 19th century ones. It is what it is. It's not something else. Most of my previous discussions of universalism have been devoted simply to the task of demonstrating that the label is apt, that this tradition is real and its pedigree is accurate. I don't regard this as assiduous at all, since most religions and other traditions in history have been named by their enemies, labels such as Unitarian, Methodist, Whig, Tory, and many others originate as hostile slurs and were subsequently accepted as accurate. So, one thing I want to ask you, Logos, because it came up a little bit earlier, the broad theme of how Dawkins got pwned is that, there's this strain within progressivism that threatens to undo everything. I guess you could say the scientific society that so many of these new atheists were defending. So one, I was going to say Moldbug was absolutely right about that, but he doesn't point to the right people. Like, we know who all the wokesters are now because they've outed themselves, and we know what they were doing 15 years ago. So did Moldbug really see this coming, or did he just get lucky?
I think he saw it coming, but pointed to the wrong people. I mean, the problem is he's taking for granted that there's a thing called science that does sciencey stuff. What he doesn't seem to be appreciating, he kind of gets it for the social sciences and everything else, because he treats the academy as like this fifth estate arm of the government setting public policy and whatnot.
Yep.
But for now, he hasn't seemed to really go at physics or biology or chemistry or any of the hard sciences and treat them kind of with the same disdain he treats something like, I don't know, computer science or sociology or anything else.
Right. And of course, by coming up with this absurd, Puritan pedigree, none of the people who actually came out in the woke movement were any of the people that Moldbug was pointing to.
Exactly. I mean, the real problem is, it's kind of like a quasi-Gödel problem. I know how cringe it is to say that, but it's like what you have is a bunch of first-order descriptive doctrinarian statements about physics and science and whatever else. But they're all being subject to second-order interpretations. What stuff gets published? What stuff gets marketed to the media? How are we supposed to interpret the findings in the papers? And that seems to do a bunch of the heavy lifting. And it's these higher-order interpretive effects that seem to be doing a lot of the lifting, that are present even in the sciences, that Moldbug seems to be kind of taking for granted. And it's interesting because I was talking with somebody about this the other day, and they said that they were right. Moldbug has this thesis that there is this divide between decay and order. And Moldbug wants to paint it as like a left versus right thing, but I had to remind this person that people on the right are often like individualist libertarians too, and they decay just as fast. And so what it seems to be is there's this it's more like there's this urge to make everything individualistic, up to individual interpretations, the abolishment of all natural laws, everything's a social construct, whatever else. And that could be left, that could be right, depending on the context, but that seems to be the big thing here. Likening this to some like Puritan, this universalist thesis, is stupid. The only reason Moldbug can do it, and this is what I told you last week, he's literally just making some stupid argument where the Protestant churches offshooted from the single Catholic Church, and they were the original singular interpretive orthodoxy. And so once Protestants did what Protestants did, they opened the floodgates so everybody can interpret everything however they want to. And that's basically all his argument is founded on.
Yeah, yeah, and the actual insurgents that we've seen take over were not anything like what he was talking about.
Exactly. So he's taken one characteristic of Protestant Christianity, that you can have like these offshoot churches that are like interpreting scripture and doing their own thing. And he's made that like the one defining characteristic of the movement we're looking at now, where everybody can have their own individuated truth. But it's obviously the Protestants thought they had like objective reasons for whatever scriptural disagreements they were talking about. It wasn't just, well, think what you want, this is my truth. These people were willing to like die or go to war over this thing. This wasn't like a this is my
Right.
own truth kind of state. Well, except the Quakers, they were pacifists. They'd probably martyr themselves. I don't know. But like, this is not the same kind of thing just because it shares one property in common.
What is worse than that too, right? Because the wokesters are, totalitarian theocrats that want to impose everything with this ironclad focus. It's
Right.
the skeptics that are the anarchic liberal types. So think of like Boghossian and Lindsay. They're the ones that are saying that these wokesters have this ironclad orthodoxy that's smothering the sciences.
They are, but they're also caught in an orthodoxy of their own.
No, it's true, but the idea that the enemy we fight
Yep.
is a sort of radical subjectivism rooted in the Protestant ethos of reading the Bible is nonsense. The people that we're fighting have more in common with the Catholics. The university system is like the Catholic Church.
Yep.
The professors are like the priests. And these people have an ironclad orthodoxy that if you step out just a little bit, it's over.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's not even mimetically relevant. It's just stupid.
Yep.
But again, the thing can only be judged as itself. I've described a few ways in which I think universalism should be considered harmful, for example, in chapter 3, but I don't think I've really presented a high-level overview of the thing as it is today, abjuring any and all snide references to the Jukes and Calicax in its stud book. Universalism, in my opinion, is best described as a mystery cult of power. It is a cult of power because one critical stage in its replicative life cycle is a little critter called the state. When we look at the big U's surface proteins, we notice that most of them can be explained by its need to capture, retain, and maintain the state, and direct its power towards the creation of conditions that favor the continued replication of universalism. It is as hard to imagine universalism without the state as a malaria without the mosquito. It is a mystery cult because it displays theistic traditions by replacing metaphysical superstitions with philosophical mysteries such as humanity, progress, equality, democracy, justice, environment, community, peace, etc. None of these concepts are defined in Orthodox Universalist doctrine is even slightly coherent. All can absorb arbitrary mental energy without producing any rational thought. In this sense, they are best compared to Platonian, Talmudic, or scholastic nonsense. I link to this David Stove piece often, and I encourage anyone who hasn't read it to do so. Now, no, this does not constitute an endorsement of everything that Professor Stove ever wrote. Well, okay, so by his definition, okay, it's a cult of power which relies on the state, and it's a mystery cult. Now, Logos, what does this sound like more to you? Protestants trying to read the Bible or the Catholic Church?
It sounds like some rogue order in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, like what is he talking about? So even on his own terms, this has more in common with the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, we've been harping on this for months.
No, I know, but on his own terms, I think that's the key thing here.
Oh well, yeah.
That's what I mean. Like, because there's the meta critique that we have, but then there's also like, even on his own terms, Moldbug says things that don't line up, and I guess here though, but to be honest, this also describes his own position. I mean, he Moldbug and the Dark Elves or whatever are a cult of a cult of power that want to control the state, and they're a mystery cult with their own special words, magic words, as they used to say. I mean, how is he fundamentally any different?
No idea.
I mean, instead of humanity, progress, blah blah blah, it would be like aristocracy, hierarchy, order. But these are words that he doesn't define. I mean, we've still been trying to figure out what he means by, the formalism. So, none of these. Okay, that the universalist mysteries are best regarded as mechanisms. When we apply our neo-hominid intuitions to a successful adaptive system such as universalism, we should think of its goal as replicative success. Of course, tradition is not a person, just as a meme is not a gene, and it has no more goals than a meme has a Mendelian inheritance. It's especially important not to confuse the personal goals of universalists with the adaptive goals of universalism. But with these caveats, we can use this analogy to deploy our mirror neurons in our own defense. Okay. For universalism, as for any other tradition, the adaptive purpose of a mystery is to confuse its host. Lacking a clear perception of reality, the infected host behaves in ways that an uninfected host would not. We call this confusion camouflage. As compared to the behavior of the uninfected, sometimes these actions are beneficial to the host or to a group, which includes the host, but their actual effect is contrary to the host's ethical standards. We can call this positive camouflage. Sometimes these actions are harmful to the host or group, which includes the host. We call this negative camouflage. If we can deploy the E word, positive camouflage contributes to evil by convincing those who do the evil that they are actually doing good. For example, if we believe Himmler's Posen speech, those who perpetrated the Holocaust believe they were carrying out a difficult but necessary duty. Negative camouflage contributes to evil by preventing its victims from resisting it. While we're on NS, the great example is Oxford Union Peace Resolution. Of course, if we were ready to deploy the E word, we have to tackle the thorny problem of defining good and evil. We have two approaches on this, or we can define our moral axis with respect to universalism. For example, if we apply this test to NS, we say that NS was evil even with respect to itself. NS ethics define good as the power and prosperity of the Deutsche Volk, and its guide, evil mustache man. The result of NS policies was the physical destruction of Germany, the conversion of the German people to universalism, the total suppression of the Volkish thought, and the death of mean Mr. Mustache. Not exactly as advertised. This approach gives us a reflexive evil or reflexive good. 2, we can define our moral axis with respect to the personal or reproductive interests of yourself, dear reader. If this criteria makes sense only with respect to a group, we can speak of the group of you, our readers, which includes me, because I sometimes do try to slog through my own long posts. If universalism harms or advances your or our personal interests, we say it exhibits Misesian evil or good. If it harms or advances your or our reproductive interests, it exhibits a Darwinian evil or good. Darwinian morality is an especially good reality check because the neo-hominid brain is, of course, designed to advance its own Darwinian interests. Any tradition that can persuade it to do otherwise has to be some pretty heavy crack. As we'll see, universalism more than fits the bill. However, to generate a really strong moral conclusion, we'd like to see agreement among all three criteria: reflexive, Misesian, and Darwinian. One way to do this is to examine some scenarios in which universalism could lead to the destruction of the neo-hominid species or the destruction of Western civilization. Clearly, any such result represents the triumph of reflexive, Misesian, and Darwinian evil. And if such results are plausible, worrying about anything smaller is a waste of time. Let's unravel this problem by starting with the universalist mystery of progress, which, as we saw in Chapter 3, Professor Dawkins calls the zeitgeist or spirit of time. First, it's worth noting that Chapter 7 of The God Delusion, in which Professor Dawkins introduces this concept, opens with a quote by one Sean O'Casey. Politics has slain its thousands, but religion has slain its tens of thousands. La Wiki describes O'Casey as a nationalist and socialist. Frankly, he sounds like a evil effort. This guy was born in 1880, and presumably he uttered his little ort of crap at some point before nationalist, socialist politics, not to mention National Socialist proper, managed to stay its tens of millions. The fact that Professor Dawkins could, in 2007, quote this Stalinist flack and his fatuous, thoroughly obsolete line, and his legion of acolytes swallow it without a hiccup may be sufficient demonstration of universalist ponage. Now, at this point, I think one of the reasons why people liked this particular article of Moldbug is since a lot of Moldbug's followers ended up being Christians, Catholics, Orthodox, Dawkins was definitely, the enemy at the time because of his, outspoken atheism. And to see Moldbug, take him to task like this was probably what a lot of people like. Because frankly, it's, not many people were saying this,
Yeah, I didn't even know Dawkins said that, to be honest. That's absurd.
Right. Well, he's favorably quoting it, but it's the stupidest thing ever. Like the New Atheists had this whole arc where they were just like, well, religion killed all these people. And I'm like, yeah, what about Soviet Union? Oh, that's just a religion, guys. Kid you not, Logos. They said it was just another religion.
It's almost like politics is a religion. So the distinction between religions and politics is stupid if that's the route they're going to take. Right? If everything is religion, then nothing is.
Right. So then they're religious.
Exactly.
Right. It's... I mean, yeah, I was saying this, but you would expect Christians to say something like this, the sort of rebuttal that Moldbug gives. But to have a secularist who's ostensibly on that side saying this, that's interesting. That's I think part of why this was so popular. But if it's worth continuing, it's worth repeating Professor Dawkins' definition of the zeitgeist, the mysterious consensus which changes over the decades. For some reason, these changes over the decades are almost always favor universalism itself. This is, of course, progress. In the spirit of time, there is a suspicious resemblance to the MO of divine providence, minus, of course, the divine bit. Since Professor Dawkins does not have providence to lean on, he is forced to find a rational explanation for this historical curiosity. His struggles are wonderful reading. Where then have these concerted and steady changes in social conditions come from? The onus is not on me to answer. For my purpose, it's sufficient that they certainly have not come from religion. Exeter Hall would beg to differ, so would Henry Reacher Board, Walter Rauschenbach, and William Sloane Coffin, etc., etc. We need to explain why the changing moral zeitgeist is so widely synchronized across large numbers of people, and we need to explain its relatively consistent direction. Indeed. First, how it is synchronized across so many people, it spreads itself from one mind to mind through conversions and conversations at bars and at dinner parties, through books and book reviews, through newspapers and broadcasting, and nowadays through the internet. Not to mention the state and its entire educational system from kindergarten to grad school. Obviously, this is less important than bars and dinner parties, but I'm just saying. Changes in the moral climate are signaled in editorials, on radio talk shows and political speeches, in the pattern of stand-up comedians, and the scripts of soap operas, and the votes of parliaments making laws and the decisions of judges interpreting them. That's an interesting word, signaled. One way to put it would be in terms of changing meme frequencies in the meme pool, but I shall not pursue that. Fortunately, Professor Dawkins, you don't have to. What impels its consistent direction, we mustn't neglect the driving role of individual leaders ahead of their time, stand up and persuade the rest of us to move on with them. Curiously enough, leaders come in all kinds of flavors. We mustn't neglect the fascinating question why the universalist ones always win and the others always lose. Oh, wait, we must neglect it. Obviously, there aren't the droids we're looking for. In America, the ideas of racial equality were fostered by the political leaders of the caliber of Martin Luther King. I know it's cheap, but I simply can't resist the temptation to attach a little innuendo to the word caliber. As Dr. King put it, I'm not a Negro tonight. And entrepreneurs, sportsmen, and other public figures such as Paul Robeson, Sidney Poitier, Jesse Owens, and Jackie Robinson. It's interesting how the zeitgeist seems to correlate with dermal pigmentation. The emancipation of slaves and of women owe much to charismatic leaders. Some of these leaders were religious, some were not. Some who were religious did their good deeds because they were religious. In other cases, their religion was incidental. Presumably, if Professor Dawkins discovered a fossil which looked a little like a chimpanzee and a little like a neo-hominid, he might regard it as an indication of a link between the two. Sadly, in the mimetic department, this lobe of his brain seems to be in the off position. Although Martin Luther King was a Christian, he derived his philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience directly from Gandhi, who was not. The number of historical solecisms in the sentence is astounding. The modern idea of civil disobedience, that is breaking the actual legal law in favor of some mysterious higher law, an obvious case of positive camouflage, dates to neither King nor Gandhi, but to Thoreau and Transcendentalism, who were, of course, direct ancestors of Universalism. Now we know why Dawkins won't say this, and I think we also know why Moldbug won't say this, but it's not a mystery why Universalism keeps winning, or why the progressives keep winning. And to pretend otherwise is just to play dumb.
It's good for business.
Yeah, well, it's good for business, but it's also the technological society's developing. So these visionaries that win out are just those visionaries who could see the next turn in the machine.
Yep.
And we know this. We know this because when Dawkins refers to the emancipation of women, okay, how did that happen? It happened with the birth control pill. So, okay, clearly this is technology. This isn't charismatic leadership. This isn't, the government public schools as Moldbug. It's stupid. It's technological development. Now, for Moldbug, that would be that's the problem then, because he wants to stop progressivism. For Dawkins, he should embrace it because he's a futurist. But like it's just obvious, that it's technology that's allowing this. And the reason why women didn't do the things they do now throughout all of human history was because they couldn't. So,
yep.
Yeah, and you're right. It is good for business as well. But again, that's, I would argue, downstream from the pressures of technology. But as for Gandhi, the Richard Grenier essay is simply essential. But why it fails to point out is that Gandhi's weird communist pseudo-Hinduism was an invention, a sort of Assasian or Kwanzaa, an Indian equivalent of the phony Gaelic revival associated with the Fenian movement. Like Nehru, Gandhi was a British lawyer with brown skin. Their movement, like its Irish counterpart, succeeded entirely through its alliance with British political forces, and in specific, the nonconformist proto-universalist Labour Party. For example, in Paul Scott's Jewel in the Crown, one character is a nonconformist missionary nun, and it's taken for granted that she has a picture of Gandhi on her wall and despises the Raj. I mean, he can't even be consistent with his terminology. I mean, if he means nonconformist literally as someone who's not a part of the Church of England, those Protestants don't have nuns. It's a Catholic thing. So what he probably means then is nonconformist in his slang sense. So now apparently Catholics can be nonconformist logos.
Yep.
So it just totally shreds his entire point of view.
Yeah, I thought the entire point was that Protestants were the first nonconformists, and that opened Pandora's box. So he has no point now.
But now apparently Catholics can be nonconformist. So here you go. Unless he's using nun in a slang sense. But then again, who knows with Moldbug these days. Anyway, to finish with this sport, it is beyond my amateur psychology and sociology to go any further in explaining why the moral zeitgeist moves in its broadly concerted way. Professor Dawkins, if you were to go any less further, you'd need a rearview mirror. For my purposes, it is enough that as a matter of observed fact, it does move, and it is not driven by religion, and certainly not by scripture, which obviously makes it a product of pure reason. It is probably not a single force like gravity, but a complex interplay of disparate forces like the one that propels Moore's law, describing the exponential increase in computer power. Boys and girls, can you say epicycle? The epicycle in Professor Dawkins' theory of history is needed to explain why, when we look at history, good always prevails over evil, or almost always. When he was railing against Christianity, Mean Mr. Mustache never ceased using the language of providence, a mysterious agency which he believed had singled him out for a divine mission to lead Germany. The second mysterious agency appears just 6 pages from Professor Dawkins' own Zeitgeist. One really wonders whether this man had read his own book. Of course, a theism-independent perspective of mimetic evolution eliminates our need for the epicycle. What Professor Dawkins is observing is simply the selective success of universalism. Universalism succeeded because it was better adapted than its competitors. Since Professor Dawkins is a universalist, of course he views this as the triumph of good over evil, but his zeitgeist is no more than the well-known fallacy of survivor bias. And Mr. Mustache's providence, which doubtless made itself scarce around 1942, is exactly the same animal. So the question remains, why does good so consistently triumph over evil? If we exclude supernatural forces which cause the good side to win elections, battles, and wars, we are left with no explanation at all of this strange phenomena so reminiscent of Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. Heads, 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 heads. It's true that people want to be good. Perhaps we should expect them to flock to the good side, outnumbering the evil. On the other hand, when we remember the phenomena of positive camouflage and see that most who do evil think of themselves as doing good, it's hard to take this seriously. And moreover, actual good has to be actually good, whereas evil by definition is capable of anything. If the military advantage is anywhere, it would seem to lie with the latter. Essentially, what we've found behind this particular universalist mystery is the assertion that universalism has triumphed because universalism is good and good triumphs. Good triumphs because universalism is successful and universalism is good. Spot the unsubstantiated assertion. Just as we have no reason at all to assume that neo-hominid populations are geographically uniform, we have no reason at all to assume that universalism is good in either the reflexive, Darwinian, or Misesian sense. Of course, we learned in school that universalism is good in at least the first and third senses, but who did we learn this from? Universalist teachers. Again, all we know is that universalism is successful, and we can say the same of universalism's ancestors. The winners write the history. If NS had won the war, citizens of the NS 2007 would see history as an inevitable progress towards the National Socialist present. The universalist historicism is effective camouflage, both negative and positive. The circular reasoning behind the mystery of progress, zeitgeist, or providence dissuades those who might be harmed by universalism from considering the possibility that universalism is not, in fact, good. It needs to be fought against. And it persuades those whose interest universalism advances that they are serving good and not evil. We are now in a position to strip off this camouflage and have a look at what's behind it. If progress is simply the victory of universalism and universalism need not be entirely good, we need to construct an interpretation of history which recognizes both progress and decay. Where universalism is good, its victory is by defeat progress. Where universalism is bad, its victory must be decay. Without mysterious or supernatural pro-good forces, we would expect to see some mix of the former and the latter. Let's cap this exercise at about 250 years, at 1757. Some universalist distortions might go back further, but they dwindle rapidly. Before this period, it is especially hard when reading typical universalist history to tell which side is supposed to be righteous and which wrongtious. Once we get to the American and French revolutions, we are left in no doubt. It is difficult for a modern-day American to construct a history of the last 250 years as a history of decay. Decay is especially concealed by the obvious history of technical and scientific progress. While this has no reason at all to correlate with political or cultural progress, the two are certainly not hard to confuse. However, one way to look at this question is to look at the traditional opposite of the word progressive, that is reactionary. Howard Zinn, for example, has given us progressive interpretation of history, which is what is a comparable reactionary narrative. Professor Zinn, of course, would like us to believe that any narrative less progressive than his is reactionary. Perhaps it is only reactionary compared to Howard Zinn. What we really need is an interpretation of history so reactionary that it contains no universalism or proto-universalism at all. Instead, it should start with the mainstream perspective of 1757 and interpret all evidence of impending universalism as the story of decline, disaster, and decay. Then we can compare the progressive and reactionary narratives on a level playing field, evaluating the relative credibility of both and decide on what points to accept which, thus allocating universalist history and implicitly universalism itself between progress and decay. For this, we need our pure reactionary theory of history. Needless to say, this is a very specialized product. It is not sold in any stores. It is not even found in a single volume. Nevertheless, the internet is a great assistance in assembling the product.
Okay, before we move on, I have to stop there because that was absurd.
Okay, go ahead.
Why would anybody in 1757 associate universalism with decay when universalism, as we've pointed out, always correlates with a rise in technological progress and increased standards of living?
Because the universalism didn't even exist yet.
Well, his kind of universalism existed. Remember, he's talking about his own colloquial kind of kumbaya, everybody's a snowflake kind of universalism or whatever. Not
libertarianism, and so you had the market revolution already going on, yeah.
Exactly. The point is, you can't go back then and look at any of this as a harbinger of decay, when every time people talk about it, it's always corresponding to higher standards of living. Where's the decay going to come from? You can't. This only works if you criticize technology itself as bringing on the changes. You have to make an argument
Yes.
that the technology itself is a ticking time bomb for society, which
Yes.
Moldbug himself can't even do.
No, he can't do that.
So why would he think that people in 1757 would have done better?
I don't know. Now he does say that where was it? Where was this? Yeah, he says here, while this has no reason at all to correlate with political or cultural progress, the two are hard. Okay, so, but you see, for him, he's a materialist. He's an atheist. Political and cultural progress. Well, politics isn't real. He's already told us that. Remember? And then
Sure.
cultural projects. Well, Hume's axiom. Cast it to the flames. Cultural artifacts are just going to get cast to the flames.
Sure.
And that's what Moldbug would do with his worldview. So yeah, I mean it doesn't work.
Yeah, so what he's about to say about this reactionary view of history is just nonsense. Even by his own standards, he couldn't have done better.
No. Well, the other thing I have to add too is these market revolution guys that have this fetish for reactionary states of old Europe. They were radically opposed to the market. They had all sorts of regulations on economic activity.
Exactly.
And none of the actual 18th or 19th century liberal authors were in favor of these institutions. It's ridiculous that Moldbug can even do this. But all right, here we go. If I had to pick 10 books from which to construct a reactionary theory of modern history, I would pick the following in order of composition, which makes a good reading order. Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Excellent. That's an excellent choice. Henry Maine, Popular Government. Never heard of him. W.E.H. Lecky, Democracy and Liberty. Never heard of him. Walter Lippmann, Public Opinion. Yeah, that's important to read. Edgar Lee Masters, Lincoln the Man. Albert J. Nock, Memoirs of a Superfluous Man. John T. Flynn, As We Go Marching. Bertrand de Juvenel on Power. Eric von Kunit, Ladine, Liberty or Equality. James Burnham, Suicide of the West. I also include links to online editions where available. All of these are, in my opinion, absolute classics and should be read by anyone even remotely interested in history. A question for readers: can anyone recommend a good reactionary history of the American Revolution, or should I say rebellion? For some reason, I haven't bumped into any Tory treatments which live up to the above standard. Let me also mention... well, real quick, maybe it's because the Tories are a sign of decay, and they're just not up to the task.
Maybe. Anything goes with this Wild West standard he's got going on here.
Yep. Let me also mention James Steffen's Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, a wonderful book, which is a little too close to the main to make this list, and also suffers from the disability that I have not yet read all of it. However, just to show there's nothing new under the sun, here's how Steffen's classic opens. The object of this work is to examine the doctrines which are rather hinted at than expressed by the phrase liberty, equality, fraternity. The phrase has been the motto of more than one republic. It is indeed something more than a motto. It is a creed of a religion, less definite than any one of the forms of Christianity, which are in part its rivals, in part its antagonists, and in part its associates, but not on that account the less powerful. It is, on the contrary, one of the most penetrating influences of the day. It shows itself now and then in definite forms, of which positivism is one of the best known to our generation. But its specific manifestations give no adequate measure of its depth or width. It penetrates other creeds. It has often transformed Christianity into a system of optimism, which has in some cases retained and in others rejected Christian phraseology. It deeply influences politics and legislation. It has its solemn festivals, its sober adherents, its enthusiasts, its Anabaptists and antinomians. The religion of humanity is perhaps a good name as can be found for it, if the expression is used in a wider sense than the narrow and technical one associated with it by Comte. It is one of the commonest beliefs of the day that the human race as collectively has before it splendid destinies of various kinds, and that the road to them is to be found in the removal of all restraints on human conduct, in the recognition of a substantial equality between all human creatures, and in fraternity or general love. These doctrines are in very many cases held as a religious faith. They are regarded not merely as truths, but as truths for which those who believe in them are ready to do battle, and for the establishment of which they are prepared to sacrifice all merely personal ends. Such a state, of course, is the most general terms, is the religion of which I call liberty, equality, fraternity to be the creed. I do not believe it. I am not the advocate of slavery, caste, and hatred, nor do I deny that a sense may be given to these words, liberty, equality, and fraternity, in which they may be regarded as good. I wish to assert with respect to them two propositions. First, that in the present day, even those who use those words most rationally, that is to say, as the names of the elements of social life, which, like others, have their advantages and disadvantages according to time, place, and circumstance, have a great disposition to exaggerate their advantages and deny the existence, or at any rate, to underrate the importance of their disadvantages. Next, that whatever significance to be attached to them, these words are ill adapted to the creed of a religion, that the things which they denote are not ends in themselves, and that when used collectively, the words do not typify, however vaguely, any state of society which a reasonable man ought to regard with enthusiasm or devotion. Compare to Maine's brilliant reactionary blast. It has always been my desire and hope to apply the historical method to the political institutions of men, but here again the inquiry into the history of these institutions and the attempt to estimate their true value and by the results of such an inquiry are seriously embarrassed by a mass of ideas and beliefs which have grown up in our day on the subject of one particular form of government, the extreme form of popular government, which is called democracy. A portion of the notions which prevail in Europe concerning popular government are derived, and these are worthy of all respect. From observation of its practical working, a larger portion merely reproduce technical rules of British or American constitutions in altered or disguised form, but a multitude of ideas on this subject, ideas which are steadily absorbing or displacing all the others, appear to me like the theories of jurisprudence of which I have spoken to have been conceived a priori. They are, in fact, another set of deductions from the assumption of a state of nature. Their true source has never been forgotten on the continent of Europe, where they are well known to have sprung from the teachings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who believed that man emerged from the primitive natural condition by a process which made every form of government except democracy illegitimate. In this country, they are not often explicitly or even consciously referred to their real origin, which is nevertheless constantly betrayed by the language in which they are expressed. Democracy is commonly described as having an inherent superiority over every other form of government. It is supposed to advance with an irresistible and primordial movement. It is thought to be full of promise of blessings to mankind, yet it fails to bring with it these blessings or even prove to be prolific of the heaviest calamities. It is not held to deserve condemnation. These are the familiar marks of a theory which claims to be independent of experience and observation on the plea that it bears the credentials of Golden Age, non-historical and unverifiable. Let me quickly explain my reactionary theory of history, which comes from reading weird, old, forgotten books such as the above. Note that this theory is quite simple. Depending on your inclinations, you may regard this as a good thing or a bad thing. In order to get the reactionary theory of history, we need a reactionary theory of government. History, again, is an interpretation, and interpretation requires theory. I've described this theory before under the name of neo-cameralism, but on a blog it never hurts to be a little repetitive. First, government is not a mystical or mysterious institution. A government is simply a group of people working together for a common aim, a corporation. Whether a corporation is good or bad is not determined by who its employees are or how they are selected. It is determined by whether the actions of the government are good or bad. Second, the only fundamental difference between a government and a private corporation is that the former is sovereign and has no higher authority to which it can appeal to protect its property. A sovereign corporation owns its territory and maintains that ownership by demonstrating unchallenged control. It is stable if no other party, internal or external, has any incentive to attack it. Especially in the nuclear age, it is not difficult to deter prospective attackers. Third, good government is a well-managed sovereign corporation. Good government is effective management. Efficient management is profitable management. A profitable government has no incentive to break its promises, abuse its citizens who are its capital, or attack its neighbors. Where does that come from, Logos?
I have no idea, man. This whole thing's a mess.
Well, you know, there was a really good example of a sovereign corporation, Logos. It was called the East India Company.
Yeah, it was.
And it totally didn't have any incentives to break promises, abuse its citizens, or attack its neighbors. Like, you have to be a special kind of stupid to say that. Fourth, efficient management can be implemented by the same techniques in sovereign corporations as in non-sovereign ones. The company's profit is distributed equally to the holders of negotiable shares. The shareholders elect a board which selects the CEO. Fifth, although the full neo-cameralist approach has never been tried, its closest historical equivalent to this approach is the 18th century tradition of enlightened absolutist as represented by Frederick the Great. That's complete absolute nonsense. The Prussian state was not a mercantile state. Like, that's just complete utter nonsense. I mean, the word is a German word, which was used to describe the efficient government that the Prussians were trying to build. But they didn't run like a corporation. It wasn't a corporation with shareholders.
Yeah.
That's just insane. And the 21st century non-democratic tradition is seen in lost fragments of the British Empire, such as Hong Kong, Singapore, and Dubai. No, neo-cameralism has been tried, and it's called the East India Company. Like, why do libertarians just have this brain fart where they just delete the East India Company from their memory?
Because it's bad. It makes them look bad. They have to memory hole it. Everybody knows that neo-cameralism is a bunch of nap upholders, Todd.
Right, and of course, why would with these morally pure nap upholders, why would you be afraid of anything? They're not going to hurt you. They're not going to aggress against you.
Yeah, we just want to make the government more efficient, bro. More efficient. It's fine. Just more efficient government.
Oh, and by the way, that's the ratchet effect for progressivism: efficiency.
Yep.
Because that's what technology is. Technology is just efficiency, and so that's why we have progressivism. These states appear to provide a very high quality of service to their citizens with no meaningful democracy at all. They have a minimal crime and high levels of personal and economic freedom. They tend to be quite prosperous. They are weak only in political freedom, and political freedom is unimportant by definition when government is stable and effective. Well, there you go, Logos. Unimportant by definition. That's a neat little trick you can pull, isn't it, Logos?
Oh, yeah.
Well, you know what? It's a neat little, how about this? Well, why can't the Marxists just say, yeah, political freedom is unimportant by definition as long as, we provide equal distribution of goods within society. Why not?
Oh, man.
What?
It is funny.
6, the comparative success of the American and European post-war systems appear to be due to their abandonment of democratic politics as a practical mechanism of government in favor of a civil service. Yeah, I know, I'm going to try that. In which democratic politicians are increasingly symbolic. The post-communist civil service states, China and Russia, appear to be converging on the same system, although the stability is ensured primarily by direct military authority rather than by a system of managed public opinion. 7th, the post-democratic civil service state, while not utterly disastrous, is not the end of history. It has two problems. One, the size and complexity of its regulatory system tends to increase without bound, resulting in economic stagnation and general apathy. 2, more critically, it can neither abolish democratic political forms nor defend itself against changes in information flow that may destabilize public opinion. Notably, the rise of the internet disrupts the feedback loop between public education and political power, although allowing non-canonical ideas to flourish. If these ideas are both rationally compelling and politically delegitimating, the state is threatened. Well, this little bit is absolutely true, which is why they put a muzzle on the internet around 2017. 8th, therefore, productive political efforts should focus on peacefully terminating, restructuring, and decentralizing the 20th century civil service state along neo-cameralist lines. The ideal result is a planet of thousands, even tens of thousands of independent city-states, each managed by profit for its shareholders. Dude, that just sounds like hell, Logos.
Sounds like Judge Dredd. I've said it before, I'll say it again. It's Judge Dredd.
It sounds, it's awful. Note this perspective has nothing at all in common with the universalist theory of government. Note also the simplicity of its transition that it suggests should have happened from monarchy as a family business to a modern corporate structure with separate board and CEO, eliminating the vagaries of the hereditary principle. Well, the thing is, right, that wouldn't actually solve the problem, because in the Federalist Papers, when they're Madison, Jay, and Hamilton are discussing previous political experiments, they discussed the Holy Roman Empire, which was an elective monarchy. So I suppose it's true that they were hereditary titles of holders of some kind, but their position within the empire was from an election by their peers, and that did not ensure the kinds of leadership quality that I think Moldbug is expecting it would have.
Yeah, it's almost like corporations in the economy face different market pressures than corporations who would be acting as governments. Go figure.
What do you know? What do you know? First, in America and Europe from the late 18th through the middle of the 19th century, we see a series of violent changes in power in which states were overthrown and territories captured by disorganized mobs of their own residents, sometimes in cahoots with the army. These were called revolutions. They were almost entirely destructive phenomena with no major point to recommend them. But what Logos, that led to all of the technological and material improvements.
Yep.
Like, he can't actually say that because he views the progress of science as a good thing. See, that's you can't be a techno optimist and a reactionary. Like what the heck? You can't square that circle. You know? You back, Logos? Huh. Can't hear Logos. I'll keep reading then. All right. Oh, he's backstage. There we go. Hey, Logos.
I don't know what happened there or why. Sorry about that.
That's fine.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that this is what I said when he first went on this arc about reactionary history. Like, he's not accounting for the fact that technological progress always gave people an optimistic outlook, and this is where his mistake is bearing fruit.
Yeah. Well, he has an optimistic outlook.
Yeah, basically.
They were okay. There's no revolution in this period which had benign results. The French revolutions of 1789 and 1830, for example, can be blamed entirely on irresolute monarchs without the courage, dexterity, or both to use the military against the mob. Well, but see that. I mean, here's the deal, right? Usually those kinds of crackdowns are what precipitate revolutions. Is you know, if for example, the Russian Revolution in 1917 was in part precipitated when the protesting workers were shot by the Russian army, Bloody Sunday. So it's it's just stupid. Like this is how the idea that you just didn't kill enough of the revolutionaries is that's what gets them to fight you, right? We mentioned this when we were talking about his Warren McIntyre appearance. The idea that if you're the weaker party, you actually want the stronger people to attack you so that you can play the victim and force them to overreact. It's just those kinds of overreactions that lead to revolutions in the first place.
Yep.
Moreover, even when states did not capitulate totally to revolutionary mobs, they often surrendered partially, as for example, the Reform Bill of 1832. This led to a progressive acceleration of democracy and its inevitable accomplice paramilitary violence. The U.S., for example, in the height of its democratic period, from 1828 to 1932, was almost never without violent elections or political gangs. I mean, what is he talking about? Like, nothing in the United States has ever rivaled what we see with political violence in like Africa or Latin America.
I mean, maybe the Civil War, and that's it.
That's it. Democratic government before the civil service era was also corrupt on an almost indescribable scale. The other thing is, what exactly does Moldbug object to? Because we know he seems to have this, fetish for defending Roe v. Wade, because he's very upset that it got overturned. And if he seems to like all of the quote unquote personal moral choices he's allowed to make now, because the bonds of religion were destroyed by progressives, what exactly does he oppose? I'm still trying to figure this out.
It's not exactly clear.
Yeah.
He just wished the government will run like a corporation. He's basically just a libertarian in reactionary clothing. That's all he is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's what it seems to be. Democracy and democratic ideologies and religions had become power cults which attracted and selected for the ambitious and unscrupulous. Wow, I'm sure that doesn't happen at all on monarchies logos. Not possible.
Mm-mm.
Numerous corrupt systems which could command voting blocks sprung up, from urban ward healer machines to yellow journal newspapers. Deceiving the voting population was job one for these political engineers, and public opinion on all political subjects, government, law, and economics, and more began to diverge significantly from reality. This situation culminated in the first great total war of the Democratic era, the War of Secession between the Union and Confederacy. The proximate cause of the War of Secession was the anti-slavery campaign, a political, religious nationalist movement in the North that harangued the South with apocalyptic rhetoric, supported paramilitary terrorist attacks on it, extracted vast quantities of tax through an almost punitive tariff, unilaterally and informally rewrote the Constitution to strengthen its own power and hold the South captive, and in general did everything it could do to stoke Southern paranoia. But the latter was hardly lacking, as the South had developed its own bizarre nationalist movement, a romantic cult which glorified a hereditary caste system and threatened to invade the entire Western Hemisphere. Yankee land excluded, and only because it was a bad land for sugarcane, tobacco, or cotton. Neither of these competing nationalisms was conceivable in the 18th century, and both are most posthumously ascribed to the effect of 80 years of democracy on the mass mind. Well, in the case of the South, that's stupid. That the South's medieval romanticism, going back to Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, is like the opposite of democracy. It's like fetishizing the Middle Ages. That's where this sort of Southern romanticism comes from. The War of Secession was a war of mass destruction in which all previously known laws of war were violated, generally by the North with its revived Puritan cult of righteousness. It killed 500,000 men and brought happiness to none but the killers. Not even the slaves whose liberation was a sham, but whose destitution was certainly not. As such, it prefigures the even more destructive wars of the following century. It also destroyed the American tradition of limited government, setting the scene for the megastate to come.
Puritanical cult of righteousness? What is he talking about?
Well, the Puritans were not. Well, what I think he's talking about is the idea of the battle cry of freedom. Christ died to save men's souls. We die to make men free. It's using all the language that the Puritans would use, but it's imbuing it with the American civil religion.
I guess, but
I think that's what Moldbug is. What a lot of reactionaries get caught up in, because these progressives use language that sounds like it came from the Puritans, but are totally secularizing it. They think that means that they're Puritan, but that's just pedantic. I mean, the substance is gone.
I mean, when I think about violating previously known laws of war, and what was done to the South, I don't think about stuff that Protestants and Puritans did. I think about crusades, massacres, genocides done by the Catholics.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, the American. I mean, I know this way of thinking because for a while I used to be very critical of the North during the Civil War, but in one sense, it was unprecedented given prior conflicts the United States had been engaged in. But compared to, say, the atrocities that took place in Latin America on a routine basis, there's nothing in the American Civil War even close to what went on in Mexico or Colombia or Peru or Argentina or Brazil. Just not even close.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the most destructive result of the 19th century democratic movement was the rise of militant nationalism, which beleaguered aristocratic elites found all too effective in deflecting the sympathies of the increasingly violent mob. Contrary to the promises of Democrats, the first taste of socialist plunder only whetted the mob's appetite for more. Democratic factions divided according to their preferred food for this great beast, money or blood. Well, this is sort of like your point, Logos. You've said this before, right? The reason why these movements rise up is that property ends up getting concentrated in the hands of a few. Life becomes too expensive for most to live, and the resources are redistributed by force.
That's it.
Maybe you should just stop centralizing the property. How about that, Logos?
How about that?
How about that? No, because that would threaten my neo-cameralist, East India Company. We can't have that. But don't worry, guys. We're not going to take advantage of you. We're just going to be NAP compliant. Duh. I mean, did you see the logo? We're NAP compliant, The NAP agency vouches for us. But then, behind the scenes, we paid them to vouch for us. Right? That's how it works. This jingoist tendency is also inconceivable in the 18th century, eventually culminated in the war which destroyed European civilization, the Great War. The first outbreak of the Great War, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, killed millions of young men and left Russia in the hands of a barbaric neo-Jacobin military death cult. Okay, this is completely idiotic nonsense. First of all, 18th century Europe was rife with war. What is he talking about? Second of all, remember who started the Great War? The monarchies of Europe, Russia, Austria, and Germany. It was all started in Serbia. So, what do you say to this, Logos?
I don't know, man.
I mean, if you're going to find one country that really started World War I, it was Russia. Because Russia gave Serbia the green light to assassinate the Archduke, which they knew full well would lead to a war. Okay, that's Moldbug's boy. That's Russia. There you go. I guess the French and the British made the Russians do it, right? Kind of like the devil made me do it, that the evangelicals would say. It's, what was it? The Universalists made me do it, right, Logos?
Yeah.
The same cult later devastated Spain, where order was fortunately restored under a nationalist government that was at least neither socialist nor expansionist. Finally, the ultimate synthesis of nationalism and socialism, fascism, restarted the Great War, which became a worldwide conflict between the militarist and socialist traditions. At the end of the Great War in 1945, memory of the Belle Epoque had dwindled to near extinction, and there was no significant political force which supported the restoration of the classical liberal era. Hey, there you go. That's what you said, Logos, right? He's classically liberal, and yet in 1757, no classical liberal would have been saying what he says.
What was that? I missed the last thing you just said.
Oh, no classical liberal would be saying the things that he says.
Oh, of course not.
But this just proves your point that he is basically a classical liberal. He owns up to it. The U.S. has succumbed to a socialist revolution under a false electoral premises in 1932. This was primarily the result of a financial panic, which was caused by the unscrupulous dilution of the money, of the currency, and the boom of the 1920s through the new Federal Reserve System. After the first phase of the Great War, the gold standard, which was never entirely stable under the Anglo-American fractional reserve system, had been restored in a broken form, the gold exchange standard, which was more tolerant of dilution through state-guaranteed maturity mismatching lending, but not tolerant enough. The collapse of this system allowed inflationist economists to claim that capitalism had itself failed, not only the famous orphan who requests clemency for the murder of his parents. This brought on a socialist revolution, the New Deal, in which the federal government and the progressive civil service machine claimed unlimited legislative power to deal with the emergency it had created for itself. I mean, the idea that FDR was socialism doesn't mean anything anymore if FDR can be called a socialist, because socialism means abolition of private property.
Yes.
Which last I checked, FDR didn't do.
Correct.
This is like, what is he talking about? I mean, private property has not been abolished. What is he talking about?
I don't know. I mean, you'd think he'd like FDR, because FDR was probably the second most formalist president we'd ever had behind Abraham Lincoln.
Right. Yeah, I know, right? It has never relinquished this power, nor can it ever be expected to. It has never restored a metallic currency, nor can it ever be expected to. Its civil service and judiciary are entirely insulated from democracy. Its legislative body, which remains bicameral for reasons now only historical, has an incumbent re-election rate in the high 90s. Its two political parties, which are no longer meaningful organizations and are now mere labels, are identical on virtually all substantive domestic policy issues. Most of their efforts are put into fighting proxy wars against each other, often involving American soldiers on distant parts of the globe, which have no relevance at all to domestic security. The federal government consumes 30% of the GDP, and the U.S. borrows 6% of GDP from abroad every year just to stay afloat. Crime is rampant, with many parts of many major cities substantially, effectively uninhabitable by any civilized person, and substantial criminal classes. Some cities, such as Detroit, have been entirely cleansed of their white population, and some places are even reverting to prairie, but very dangerous prairie. Former residents of the cities whose old Irish, Italian, and Jewish quarters no longer exist have fled to more defensible quarters in hideous strip mall suburbs. Encouraged by both parties, which jockey for their votes, uneducated peasants from Latin America are flooding in unknown numbers across its uncontrolled borders. Fortunately, so far, this new generation of immigrants has seen little of the joys of the criminal lifestyle, but this seems to change quickly for their children. In short, the U.S. is rapidly becoming a third world country, not unlike present-day Brazil. The only mercy is that the only mercy is that its respite from democracy has lasted. Well, there you go, Logos. Remember, hobbits, stay home, don't do anything, and we'll just wait for the Democrats to bring in voters to stay in power forever. Huh. That doesn't really work, does it, Logos?
No.
After the Great War, the socialist powers fell out, as gangs often do. The first was the U.S.-Soviet split, in which the latter turned out to be more interested in territory and power than in a position as a U.S. satellite. In the resulting Cold War, these two powers dismembered the remnants of European law and order in the Third World. In the worst scramble for colonial supremacy the world has yet seen, any pretext of bringing good government to uncivilized peoples was forgotten, and any national thug, preferably as a socialist as possible, was a satisfactory client for either side. Most of the non-European world, including even formerly civilized countries such as China, reverted to the rule of national socialist warlords who competed for American and Soviet favor. Some, such as Yugoslavia and China, split from both factions and courted the aid of both. Perhaps 100 million people around the world were murdered in this liberation, which is still revered as such worldwide. The supposedly independent countries of the Third World are still dependent on aid from the U.S. and its European satellites. There's only one exception. There's only one independent Third World country in the world, Somaliland. Well, there you go, because Somalia is an anarchy that doesn't have a government logo. See, that's right, but being run by warlords is great. Isn't that great, Logos? Don't try to be run by warlords.
Well, I mean, it's certainly a formalist system. You know who's in charge.
True. Meanwhile, competing branches of the U.S. government still engage in third world proxy wars in which the Defense Department and its political allies and satellites, the Republican Party, the arms and energy industry, Israel, face off against the State Department and its allies and satellites, the Democratic Party, NGOs, universities, Europe, Palestine. The true nature of these conflicts, which would end instantly if the U.S. were under unitary leadership, or even if both U.S. factions could agree to cut off aid to all their foreign satellites, is admitted by no one. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, Logos. Did the fact that England have a king eliminate court intrigues?
No.
I know. Like, how do you get this level of brain damage? The idea that unitary leadership will just stop factional infighting.
I mean, look at Disney. It's a corporation. And there's been a civil war between, like, Jon Favreau and then whoever that woman was who finally got canned for ruining Star Wars. Look at Marvel. There's a massive civil war in the Marvel franchise where somebody stepped up and she was doing a bunch of SJW stuff with the movies. The movies have been tanking. And now she's basically just left. Like, even corporations have factional intrigue and infighting. Nothing changes. It's a feature of power.
Yeah. Almost like the only way to avoid intrigues in courts and parties is to not have centers of power. Almost.
I mean, the paradox is, no matter where you are, you're going to have some center of power, even if it's just local. I mean, even he wants thousands and thousands and thousands of little neo-cameralist, like, government things. But each of them will still have their own intrigues and politics and fighting, just like Disney and Marvel and LucasArts and all the other stuff going on right now.
Yeah. It is considered entirely normal that the U.S. often arms and always talks with both sides of these bizarre, incurable pseudo-wars. Lately, the old Third World neo-national socialist movements has managed to refit itself with an Islamic facade and destroyed a couple of very large buildings in New York, killing thousands of people. No effective effort against the perpetrators has been mounted, probably because any successful American military effort brings political prestige to the American right and threatens to reignite the old era of nationalist jingoism, a threat which terrifies the American left, and for good reason. Wait, what does he mean? No effective effort has been taken against the perpetrators. I mean, the United States by this point had invaded Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yep.
So many individuals involved with the attack live and continue their efforts in a country which is not at war with the U.S. nor vice versa. Most Americans consider this entirely normal. The concept of war itself has been under attack for the last 50 years in favor of an entirely new legal model which is derived from domestic criminal justice and which seemed designed to make it as difficult as possible for civilized forces to defeat uncivilized ones. A theory which certainly fits with short-term political needs of its proponents. The resulting concept of asymmetrical warfare is also generally accepted with only a little grumbling as a necessary burden that must be shouldered by our great and moral nation. Other than this, everything is fine. Technology is moving along pretty well. Moore's Law continues to zoom along. We have fast computers and fancy mobile phones and other things that no one in the 18th century could dream of. If they could see our political system, however, I'm afraid they'd understand it all too well. Well, there you go. He's an optimist. You can't be a reactionary. Frankly, any system of thought that can convincingly present this history as a case of progress is capable of anything. Readers may, of course, differ with my interpretation of events, but hopefully at this point, they at least understand why I see universalism as a parasitic tradition. I mean, he really didn't really give us a theory of reactionary history at all.
No. I don't know exactly what this has to do with universalism being parasitic.
Well, he made no attempt to demonstrate that.
There's no link to universalism through most of the thing, except for bringing in like here and there. We made like a little quip about the Civil War. It's like, oh, they had Puritan fervor and they violated all the standards of warfare and blah, 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 blah. It's like, listen, man, I'm not seeing the connection between memes. I'm seeing a bunch of politics and people and stuff in the world going on. But if this was supposed to be the part where you showed that universalism was parasitic, I got nothing.
No, he didn't. It's just a lot of rambling. How Dawkins got pwned, Chapter 5, Planet 3.01. So in the course of the previous chapters, we've established that Professor Dawkins is pwned. He is pwned because he is serving the interests of a tradition called Universalism, a non-theistic sect of Christianity, which is currently the planet's dominant religion. And Professor Dawkins has not done his homework on Universalism. As we've seen, he's accepted Orthodox Universalist interpretations of major aspects of reality. If anthropology and history count as major in exactly the same way that his favorite straw men accept theistic metaphysics by declaring it true until proven false, he appears to be quite unaware of how creepy this is. Oh, so I just thought of something. I think what we're seeing with someone like Moldbug and also someone like Steve Saylor is these are science bros that don't like it how the sort of political bromides of equality force them to not talk about or to deny differences between the sexes and the races. And I think that's where a lot of this resentment is coming from, because it's like, well, it's just not scientific.
Yeah.
What was funny about that?
Just science being turned against everybody, man. Everybody wants to control science.
And yeah, well, because basically that's our religion. Our religion isn't universalism; it's science. And Ernst Jünger called it technology is the metaphysics of the 20th century. Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Because it's power. That's why everybody wants to control science, because the process of scientific development, technological development gives you power. And if you control that, you have that power. Or at least he was unaware. If he is reading these messages, Professor Dawkins is now sunk, I'm sure, in misery and despair. He's questioning his own sanity. Is there any path back to reality? Is anything left but sickness, confusion, lies? Can anything now be real and good and true? Or has the worm but lunched too long? The answer actually is yes. The worm has lunched too long. There is no escape, not for Professor Dawkins, not for me, not for you, not for anyone. We'll simply have to deal. If the infection were fresh, we could escape just by asking and answering two simple questions. One, is universalism good or evil? Two, if the latter, what should I personally do about it? If universalism were Scientology or the cult of Kim Jong il, or even communism, this might be an effective initial state from which to consider its merits or demerits. But universalism is to these pissant little knockoffs as the Holy Roman Catholic Church and Apostolic Churches to Robert Schuller's House of Power, Hour of Power, as Detective Durkin put it in Split Second. We need bigger guns. We've got to get bigger guns. In fact, if you just translate the word Catholicism into the 20th century English, it comes out, you guessed it. I was recently disappointed to learn that, contrary to the assertion of my 10th grade English teacher, Darth Vader does not actually mean Dark Father in Dutch. That would be Donker Vader, which somehow doesn't even have the same, French. But you get the idea. The point is that this thing, whatever you care to call it, is at least 20 years old and it's probably more like 5. It's basically the Reformation itself. And Moldbug is basically full of shit. It's certainly the most up-to-date revision of Juvenal's Minotaur, and just walking up to it and denoting it as evil is about as likely to work as suing Shub Niggurath in small claims court. So if there's any way to even contemplate this history-devouring horror, it can only be by thinking around universalism. We cannot hope to assault the elder ones. We cannot even offend them. Our only hope is to amuse them for a little while. In other words, it may be a fun parlor game to answer every political question by asking how the Duke of Wellington would handle it. But we lack anything like the shared cultural capital we'd need to simply evaluate the proposition that universalism is just evil and needs to be terminated. And with extreme prejudice. We can't even imagine how to think these thoughts. And universalism at every turn will be telling us we were evil for even starting to think them. On the bright side, however, by accepting the possibility that universalism exists, that it's not simply ethics or justice or science or history, you have already taken the first step toward thinking around it. Let's take a few more steps and see where we end up. First, remember that universalism is a mystery cult of political power, as John Gray puts it. Modern politics is a chapter on the history of religion. This is not to excuse Professor Gray, whose incredible legerdemain and skipping directly from the French Revolution to George W. Bush does much more to conceal than to explain. But as Hunter S. Thompson used to put it, even a blind pig finds an acorn every once in a while. To exchange the neo-hominid instinct for worship, we need a grand mystery, some question of transcendental importance to which no meaningful answer can be constructed. It is even better if inside the mystery is some high agency, some power which works in mysterious ways. Christopher Maltisanti decided that this higher power for his 12-step program was his mafia oath. Sometimes I suspect that if you go to AA meeting in Berkeley, their higher power in the United Nations, or maybe the State Department, or even just NPR. In this chapter, we're going to try to raise the tone and avoid taking cheap little digs at universalism or universalists. Remember, Logos, Todd's Law, Moldbug is going to do the opposite of what he tells you he's going to do. So buckle up for some, cheap digs, right, Logos? The point is the spiritual antenna of the universalists are aimed almost exclusively in the direction of the state. When a universalist thinks about good and evil, she thinks about the good state and the evil state. Our goal in learning to think around universalism is to construct a way to think about the state that is morally neutral and that does not depend at all on universalist concepts. The end product should be a complete drop-in replacement for universalism, which does not challenge or threaten it in any way. Now, this is interesting, Logos, right? Well, I have no idea where he's going to go with this. But what basically Moldbug is saying in 2007 here is that a direct attack on the system is impossible, that we need to find some way to get around it by thinking in new ways. I mean, these are things that I've been saying over the last year. But of course, I don't know if he actually means it.
Well, I mean, it's exactly what he said in that interview that we criticize.
I'm sorry, what, the one with Warren McIntyre?
Yeah, where he had those clever metaphors for intercourse and politics, right? It's basically the exact same position.
Oh, yeah.
It's the exact same position. Do it all at once when you have the power, or don't do it at all. It's basically exactly what he's saying now and then.
Yeah. But But that makes absolutely no sense, because if you don't have the power now and you don't go through incremental steps to get it, you'll never get it.
Yeah, he has this view where anytime the right tries to play its hand and get some sort of foothold of power, it'll trigger a reaction from the left that'll devour everything they have. So basically, he only thinks the right can win is if they blitzkrieg and do everything all at once successfully and stop any leftist retaliation. Anything short of that will be defeat.
Yeah, I mean, okay. I mean, okay, Moldbug. Our first step is a linguistic reconstruction of politics and history. I outline this reconstruction for the state I live in, which I think is reasonable because this particular polity happens to be more or less dominate the world. As Tom York put it, Radiohead works like the United Nations. I'm the US. If you live in Greenland or Poland or Uzbekistan or whatever, the transformation should not be too difficult. Just as we saw in the universalist concept of humanity, there is an enormous inherent confusion in universalist political linguistics. There's also an enormous amount of inherent confusion in Moldbug's political linguistics. When I talk about America or the US, I may mean one of the following concepts: a political organization, a geographical region, or a population of neo-hominids. For the first or the third, I may mean this concept solely in the present, or I may be referring to the some period of historic continuity. A more preposterous hodgepodge could scarcely be contemplated. Frankly, this is ridiculous. It has to go. The Amsonian ambiguity, a programmer might call it overloading, may be potentially poetically touching. That is, if you're a political shill poet like Lowell, Whitman, MacLeish, or Dove, finish your ode to Stalin and get out of here. The rest of us would like a way to clearly refer to clear specific concepts. Logos, when has Moldbug ever clearly referred to concepts?
Never. That's why it's hilarious.
Well, I guess instead of writing an ode to Stalin, he's going to write an ode to Rockefeller.
Maybe.
Right, because he's going to be on the private corporation. But then it turns out that Rockefeller likes Mao, and they're all like buddies. So how does that work?
Oh, wow. Did Rockefeller like Mao?
Yeah, he praised Mao for turning China into a modern society.
Wow. The more you know.
One way to do this is to imagine we're thinking about an alternate reality. In reality 2, there is a clone of Planet 3, Planet 3.01, which is exactly identical and follows the same orbit around the sun, 180 degrees out of phase so that neither can see the other. On Planet 3.01, the temperate and subtropic latitudes of the northern continent and the western hemisphere are a region called Plainland, an English translation of Vinland. The inhabitants of Plainland are the Plainlanders. Culturally, our Plainlanders fall into 5 major castes: the Brahmins, Dalits, Helots, Optimates, and Vaisyas. They can also be divided by descent: European, African, Asian, or Beringian. What is this? It's ridiculous. Oh, the Bering Sea. I don't know why that's in there. And their political conflicts identify them as either coaster blue or middle or red. Of course, none of these categories is precise or complete. All sorts of overlaps and subcategories exist. Nevertheless, these very rough, high-level abstractions are quite useful. Plainland is owned by a sovereign corporation, or SovCorp. Its name is WashCorp, the Washington Corporation. I like this slightly better than the one I tried earlier, Fedco. It sounds more neutral and enormous. Of course, Planet 3.0 has plenty of actual companies named WashCorp and Fedco, but none is particularly significant. A corporation is just... Oh, here we go, Logos. A corporation is just a set of people working together with a common purpose, basically an organization. There you go.
There you go.
Wow. I just, you know what it is? A corporation, Logos, is just people coming together to do people stuff.
That's it. And if there's anything more nefarious going on, you're just a conspiracy theorist.
I know. It's just people coming together to do people stuff. I mean, they're not poisoning the water by polluting with industrial runoff. They're not, bringing in foreign workers to undercut the domestic labor force. They're not poisoning our food supply. No. No, they're just doing people stuff. What do you?
Yeah.
You crazy Marxist conspiracy theorist. What are you talking about? I should probably replace this word as well, but it is such an effective offensive weapon that it would be a pity just to throw it out, and the English meaning is extremely clear. Okay, you know what? He never defined sovereign. Remember the last time he tried, he had to just use this nonsense ring of finargle. So we still have no idea what sovereignty means for Moldbug.
Well, yeah, I mean, sovereignty just means that you have power, people know you have power, and you cannot be made to lose power by an assassination or something like that. So,
Then nobody could ever be sovereign on that.
well, exactly. Or, well, basically, what it means is the closer you are to the Ring of Finargle, the more sovereign you are. So the closer you are to an ironclad, unstoppable dictator, the more sovereign you are. So Stalin, for example, is
Uh-huh.
probably as good as it gets.
Yeah, good as it gets. A corporation is sovereign in the SovCorp if there is no controlling legal authority to which it can appeal and its response for enforcing and defending its own law. Again, the English meaning of this word is extremely clear and historically accurate. Aside from the fact that it is sovereign, WashCorp owns plain land in the same sense that any person or organization owns any piece of property. It exercises absolute and total dominion and control. Plainlanders exist at WashCorp's sufferance, so can expel them, kill them, order them to obey arbitrary commands. There's no other power to which they can appeal. No Plainlander or combination of Plainlanders has or could conceivably have even a thousandth of the military force needed to defeat WashCorp. Nor does any such force exist anywhere on the planet. Note that Planet 3.01 is identical to Planet 3.0 in all substantial details. Let me add, however, the stipulation that on Planet 3.01 and within the boundaries of Plainland, WashCorp is absolutely invincible. Oh, more science fiction logos. Yeah, if we have an absurd science fiction fantasy, then my theory works.
Yeah, just another Ring of Finargle.
It's not even worth thinking about a military strategy which could wrest Plainland from the eternal iron grip of WashCorp. Also, the flag of WashCorp is a red W, inscribed in a white circle on a red flag, and the sigil is honored with a Roman salute. Everything else is the same, though. I should also describe the history of WashCorp. It was founded by an aristocrat and military leader, General Washington, hence the name, a prominent sympathizer of a paramilitary gang called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons evolved into the first identified ancestor of WashCorp as we know it today, the Continental Congress, with its Continental Army under Washington, who swiftly establishes himself as princeps. This version of WashCorp is the first corporation of the Continental Corporation. The period of its formal existence, 1776 to 1789, is the Continental period. The first corporation's goal was to use violent force to seize Playland from its original European owner, the SovCorp British Crown. Assisted by political divisions within the British Crown, it succeeded in this task and assumed ownership of Plainland through adverse possession, winning the War of Atlantic Separation. The original first corporation was very weak and had limited power over its subsidiaries. The province of Plainland, which retained much of their original sovereignty, as recognized in both its primary contract, the Articles of Confederation, and its deed of cession as conceded by the British Crown, the Treaty of Paris. In 1789, a group of prominent managers wrested power from the first corporation and replaced it with the second, or constitutional corporation, 1789 to 1861, which left the relationship between WashCorp and its provinces informal. The primary contract of the second corporation, the Constitution, was designed by its primary architect, Alexander Hamilton, one of Washington's cronies, to shift sovereign power gradually, subtly, and irresistibly away from the provinces and toward WashCorp itself. Compared to the similar approach of present-day Eurocorp, interprovincial tensions always undermined this strategy, and in 1861, a group of provinces joined forces and attempted to seize the southern half of Plainland in the War of Southern Separation. Under the Messianic dictator Abraham Lincoln, WashCorp won this war and subjugated the rebellious provinces. No more was heard about provincial sovereignty. The War of the Southern Separation effectively revoked the Constitution and converted WashCorp's management process to an informal system with no strict textual basis. Opening the third or nationalist period, 1861 to 1933, it is also notable for its introduction of military slavery, the draft, to WashCorp's playbook. All major WashCorp wars of the 1970s were fought with Plainlander slave soldiers. The third corporation retained many elements of the old constitutional system, notably the theory that WashCorp's sovereign discretion was constrained by a list of enumerated powers. However, it was also developed a state religion of transcendental power worship or nationalism. The quintessential nationalist tract is the science fiction novel Looking Backward by the social gospel fanatic Edward Bellamy, which predicted with remarkable prescience that by the year 2000, WashCorp would exercise complete and detailed control over the lives and occupations of all Plainlanders. The essential idea of nationalism was that WashCorp was deeply and fundamentally good and could bring the spirit of righteousness to everything it touched or did. If this seems hard to understand, it is the best explained as a continuation of the Protestant postmillennial tradition, with its emphasis on achieving the New Jerusalem, the kingdom of Christ on earth. Well, I mean, remember, pop quiz logos. With what was the millennial tradition around Constantine?
I don't know. Why would I know the answer to that question?
Well, post-millennialism, because in order to justify the church fathers at the time, to justify his position, believed that he had brought in the end of history. So the idea that this is a Protestant thing is just stupid. It's a Catholic thing. They started it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because, Constantine ended history. He was the first end of history, I guess, Logos. Or supposed to be.
He was the first, but not the last.
Yeah. Nationalism can only be understood with respect to the system known as democracy, in which Plainlanders reconsecrate their absence to Watch Corp regularly and indirectly, pledging their submission to one of several, typically two, but really one or three political gangs or parties. The parties alternate in power according to headcount or registered supporters. In the late constitutional and early nationalist periods, Wash Corp operated under the spoils system, in which the parties distributed Wash Corp's revenue to their supporters by disguising these dividends as the salaries for so-called jobs. The democracy, which has deep roots in the English dissenter sects to which early Euro Plainlanders subscribed, is best seen in terms of the system of ritual legitimacy. It replaced divine right monarchy. The older divine right Sov Corp legitimized their ownership, that is, persuaded their subjects not to rebel by attributing it to the divine intervention. Democracy. Well, how did that work, Logos? I remember a king lost his head for that. Democracy arrived with the advent of new religious systems which stress the divine nature of humanity. Right, Logos, because don't you remember the Reformation when they said that the human nature was divine?
Oh, yeah.
This inner light, okay, now he's going after the Quakers here, of which all adult males and later females had exactly one, could be counted in some. If Wash Corp was directed by this arithmetic, its actions could not fail to be righteous. As the 20th century opened, nationalism evolved into its more sophisticated successor, progressivism, a label still used today. Progressivism, which is essentially the political projection of universalism, was a check to the abuses of democracy, reducing the power of corrupt elected officials in favor of permanent Wash Corp employees or civil servants. Perhaps the word master would be more apropos. Progressives consider these employers professional, nonpartisan, objective, etc., but they still operate under the moral umbrella of democracy, whose righteousness is undiminished, however symbolic or passive its elected officials may become. Note that this is not unlike the modern fate of constitutional monarchy. In extreme progressivism is practiced today by Eurocorp, meaningful politics can be eliminated entirely, but the Sovcorp still considers itself perfectly democratic. Needless to say, so do its subjects. The defunct people's democracies of Russia and Central Europe, though dominated by security forces rather than educational organs, follow a similar pattern. Wash Corp was also a leader in developing a comprehensive official education system. Like many techniques of the 20th century, Sovcorp's official education, which includes official primary, secondary, and tertiary instruction, official scientific research, official journalism, and broadcasting, etc., is essential to prevent democracy from degenerating into civil war or rebellion. Otherwise, political conflicts are simply too real, and parties become attracted by their creative opportunities of escalating violence. I mean, this is what's so stupid, right? Because even in his own day, it was the parties that were instilling the political violence. I mean, basically, Antifa is just a rent-a-mob for the Democrats.
Basically, yeah.
So he's saying that the politicians want to control the violence, eliminate the violence through, mass socialization. But that's the opposite. They're trying to constantly provoke the violence. What is he talking about?
I have no idea. The only question is if he's just wrong on purpose or on accident.
I mean, because even in his own day, right? I mean, you had a lot going back to the 60s, right? A lot of these radical elements that were violent were used as extremists to make the radical policy claims of progressive Democrats seem the sensible middle.
And he's actually talked about that previously in other essays. He knows about that.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does. Moldbug is schizoid. Either the Sovcorp security organs become its first line of defense or it succumbs to the mayhem. There are no modern examples of a stable democratic Sovcorp without an effective system of official education. Needless to say, coordinating the opinions of the population is one way to make them loyal workers and soldiers in wartime and reliable taxpayers in peacetime. 20th century Sovcorps can be classed broadly by their choice between two models of domestic security. Educracy, in which the Sovcorps manages the opinions of its subjects with an official education system and confirms that the system is working by subjugating itself to democratic elections, and securocracy, in which the Sovcorp forgets democracy and simply trusts its security forces, the ultimate guardians of order. They're doing that right now, Logos. What is he talking about?
I mean, maybe they weren't back in 2007. Heck, maybe they were. I don't know.
No, of course they were, because only 4 years later, we have Occupy Wall Street. What do? Bloomberg rolls out the police. The last line of defense is the security state.
Yep.
I mean, the Cold War transitioned America into the security state. So...
And September 11th was the final nail in the coffin.
Yes, that was the final nail. It had existed for a while with the end of World War II and the Cold War, but yeah, that was the nail in the coffin. And what's kind of ridiculous is compared to the actual threat posed by the Soviet Union in the Cold War and just how pitiful the Islamic threat was. The Soviet Union wasn't enough to get people to sign all this stuff away, but Islam was. That's ridiculous when you think about it. This is a continuous spectrum. All securocratic Sovcorps also maintain official education systems, and all educratic Sovcorps have effective, trustworthy security forces. But this is generally a consistent pattern of dominance and conflicts between educational and security agencies, for example, between journalists and policemen, which favors one or the other. The whole public education system, there's a lot that you can say about it that's negative. But I think the real way that they control people passively is through keeping them sort of dazed and confused with the psyop that is advertising. I mean, advertising is psychological warfare. These were concepts pioneered in World War I that Edward Bernays then used to help Madison Avenue sell stuff. They're literally waging, corporations and the government are literally waging on the American people psychological warfare. That's what's keeping us in check for now. But of course, you can't say that. Official education was an essential step in Washcorp's new goal for the 20th century, the conquest of Europe. By intervening in the First Great War, Europe's first total civil war since 1815, at a point when the Central and Entente powers had nearly defeated each other, Washcorp smashed the remnants of the concert of Europe, destroyed the House of Romanov, and conveyed its possessions to the new ultra-progressive and ultra-violent Sovcorp, and began the process of remodeling Europe as a cluster of Washcorp client states. Well, didn't do that after World War I. What is he talking about? That took a lot longer. By forming an alliance with Sovietsky Soyuz, the notorious Popular Front, and by using diplomatic ultimatums to intimidate the Japanese Sovcorp, Dai Nippon, into a hopeless preemptive attack, Washcorp inserted itself into the Second Great War, completed the destruction of Europe and Japan with merciless, indiscriminate bombing campaigns that killed more than 1 million civilians, and graduated to the task of dividing global power between itself and Sovietsky Soyuz. When you're feeling it, as they say, you're feeling it. Meanwhile, the nationalist period ended in 1933 with the rise of the Voldemort system, or New Deal. Why does everybody make reference to Harry Potter logos?
Because it's so easy.
Yeah, I guess. Washcorp had destroyed its financial system by adopting the British model of central banking, which Washcorp itself guaranteed the value of private loans. During the 1920s, this created a pyramid of debt substantially exceeding the quality of gold available to pay it. And when the pyramid collapsed, Plainland, although along with most other countries, was devastated. This set the stage for the rise of unscrupulous aristocrat Lord Franklin Voldemort, often simply known as that man, whose rule inaugurated the current Fourth or Universal Corporation. Two things, Logos. One, you're the financial bunny guy. Is there anything you want to say about the Great Depression?
Uh, Plenty. Which part? Hold on. Let me untangle this real quick. Guarantees the value of private loans during the 1920s has created a pyramid of debt substantially exceeding the quantity of gold available to pay it. When the pyramid collapsed, well, yeah, that's the problem. I mean, oh my goodness, the way that's the way that's worded is insane. Yes, the problem was the gold standard. The problem was the fact that we had a rapidly growing global economy and we weren't able to keep up with the money supply, the demand for money. I mean, even Milton Friedman, who's hardly like a left-wing economist, notes that. Like he talked a bunch about it in the monetary history of the United States. He was a big monetarist guy. And he'd say you can't fix everything by fixing the money supply, but if you don't address the money supply problems, you cannot have enough money to meet the demand for money, which freezes transactions. It allows bank runs and things like that. So like, the gold standard fetishism, I'll never understand it. I'll never understand it.
The other thing too is Milton Friedman pointed out how the German central bank did a good job at combating inflation after the Weimar years because it remembered how bad things could get.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So he did say that, and libertarians would always ignore the German central bank. Lord Voldemort, dude, this sounds like a progressive. I remember when Trump got elected, all over Twitter, progressives were saying, "Now I know what it's like to be Harry Potter fighting Lord Voldemort." Like,
yeah, my response to those people is always like, yeah, well, maybe one day you'll learn what it's like to be in your presence, Mrs. I will not tell lies.
yeah. Lord Voldemort, elected on a platform of scaling back WashCorp, instead seized absolute power, eliminating the last formal limits to WashCorp's domestic power. Wait, but that's good, Logos! He eliminated the last formal limits to WashCorp's domestic power. Isn't that good?
I don't know.
Well, no, for Moldbug, he wants formalism, right? He wants the power to be unlimited.
Yeah, you'd think.
His staff of extreme progressives dedicated themselves to implementing Bellamy's vision of an industrial army and ideal planned society in which WashCorp employees coordinated all productive activity in plain land. I mean, as opposed to what? Having a corporation do exactly the same thing?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's like we say, look, when other people drop bombs on countries, those are bad, evil bombs. But when we drop bombs on countries, they're happy, progressive, feminist bombs.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
It's that with corporations for Moldbug.
Yeah. Voldemort even put his name on a book called Looking Forward. Nationalist holdouts prevented this vision from being realized before WashCorp's intervention in the Second Great War. But after 1941, the last anti-Voldemort forces were politically isolated and destroyed. The post-war period saw an enormous expansion of official education and progressive tradition, completing and cementing the fourth corporation, which rules Plainland to this day. I think pretty much the internet has killed the progressive consensus. That's why they're relying on force more and more, because there's no common base they can appeal to now.
Mm-hmm.
An official education in Plainland today instructs Plainlanders to revere Lord Voldemort and his movement. All orthodox political factions claim pure Voldemortian descent, and all private business operate as a quasi-autonomous subsidiaries of WashCorp, which has settled on the elegant design of allowing their managers full entrepreneurial freedom while managing total regulatory control over their operational policies and procedures. Oh, I mean, well, what an imposition, Logos. What an imposition. I mean, how dare the government do that? I mean, they're just stopping people from doing people things. I mean, I'm sure they're not imposing externalities on the rest of us, right, Logos?
Mm-hmm.
However, all is but utterly copacetic in all is not utterly copacetic in Plainland. In the 1920s, saw the first outbreak of a genuine anti-WashCorp murmuring since the War of Southern Separation, as some Plainlanders started to realize that their interests in WashCorps were not always identical. After the proto-Voldemortian era of progressive fanatic Woodrow Wilson, the return to normalcy sanity of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge actually reduced the size and importance of WashCorp. Well, yeah, because these were agents of business, right? So of course the business interests would want the government to get out of their way, right?
You'd
That
think.
that the same feat was achieved by Ronald Reagan in an attempt unsuccessfully by a variety of failed political rebellions such as Joseph Strom Thurmond, Joseph McCarthy, Barry Goldwater, and George Wallace. While none of these movements actually aimed at the destruction of WashCorp and none had any chance of permanently checking its expansion, they can only be described as worrisome. I wonder how Trump can be. You see, this is all just BS, right? Because Trump is a manifestation of this anti-WashCorp murmuring. And what does Moldbug do?
No idea what.
Well, no, he sides with WashCorp. He's like, oh, the Trump is terrible. Jan 6. Oh, no. It's like he was just lying to us the whole time.
Well, yeah, but when has that been any different?
No, I know. But like, I'm just reading this and I'm like, well, yeah, you know who comes after Ronald Reagan, right? Donald J. Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And now you view this as like, oh, no, stop the press. You know, we have to stop the hobbits from taking over.
They're not letting us dark elves have our fun.
One fascinating response to the development of discontent is the rise of pro-WashCorp ultra-loyal pseudo-opinion movements, comparable to Catholic ultramontanism. After the Second Great War, the size, effect, and ideological consistency of WashCorp's system of official education considerably increased. The 1960s saw the harvest of this program with the rise of extremist ultra movements such as SDS. The SDS Manifesto, the Port Huron Statement, is worth reading in full as a universalist confession, as an expression of faith in the absolute righteousness of WashCorp, if led, of course, by the enlightened, and an action plan for seizing the universities and redoubling the ideological intensity of official education. Needless to say, the plan succeeded, and the ideas of the SDS are now mainstream. With WashCorp becoming the default employer and financial guardian of all Plainlanders, political conflict in Plainland increasingly transitioned to a highly stable phase in which all significant conflicts was not between pro-WashCorp and anti-WashCorp Plainlanders, but between different factions within WashCorp itself. Real quick, Logos, have you noticed that Planet 3.01 is not substantially different at all from Planet 3.01? So what's even the point of this?
It could be just another layer of satire that he uses. Like, imagine a planet that's not like ours, and blah, 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 blah. And he's probably going to get to the end like he did that one time and be like, oh, wait, it's basically the same thing.
Yeah. These battles tend to play out in WashCorp's so-called foreign policy in the 1940s, the high Voldemortian plan of creating a single global Sovcorps by converting the victorious alliance of the Second Great War, the United Nations, into a permanent Sovcorps cartel, which could cohere gradually in the usual manner, suffered a major setback when a schism appeared between WashCorp and its primary progressive client, Sovietsky Soyuz. This Anglo-Soviet split was due to the paranoid and militaristic management style of the securocratic progressive people's democracies, as was demonstrated by the further mafia-style catfights such as the Titoists and Maoist split with Moscow. However, the Anglo-Soviet split also divided WashCorpers into one faction whose primary goal was opposing Soviet power, and another faction whose primary goal was healing the spirit and restoring unity in the global progressive movement. These factions faced off in 3 Asian proxy wars, 2 of which actually involved Plainland slave soldiers, the Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese civil wars. Which, by the way, Logos, the Chinese won all 3 of those. So if the United States wants round 4 with China, buckle up.
Oh, man.
Go ahead.
No, that's a good point. I didn't even think of that.
No, China won all 3 of those. And yeah, you know, so
Yeah.
the U.S. thinks it's going to actually beat China now. That's cute. In the Chinese Civil War, different departments of WashCorp backed opposing armies with the State Department supporting Mao and the Pentagon and Chiang. The state succeeded with the aid of the New Deal political general George Marshall in imposing an arms embargo on Chiang, who was reactionary and corrupt, and ensuring his defeat at the hands of Mao, who was a murderous megalomaniac. Not only did Mao murder 3 million Chinese, but only 3 years later, his slave armies were fighting directly against the Pentagon zone. It was slightly difficult to explain to Plainlanders that while evil mustache man's myrmidons were so evil that it was necessary to level Germany and accept no terms but unconditional surrender, Mao's progressive volunteers could not even be frowned at until they had actually crossed the Korean border, and preferably not even the 38th parallel. Progress, however, can explain anything, and by the 1950s, WashCorp had a lot of practice. the even more bizarre gladiatorial bloodbath of Vietnam, in which it was almost impossible to recognize anything resembling a military strategy or objective, was so hard for plainlanders to understand that it eventually wound up as a political victory for the ultra-loyalist radicals, now recognized as our modern-day blue state coasters. Vietnam was so confusing that after the Pentagon had won a complete military victory over the South Vietnamese insurgents, state prevailed by simply capturing Congress and imposing the surprise arms embargo on the corrupt reactionary leaders of South Vietnam, treating them much as it had treated Chiang. The resultant North Vietnamese invasion surely remained a few democratic silverbacks on the good old Popular Front days when the Red Army rode into Poland on plainland-made jeeps. Interesting. So the alternate history, the alternate planet, not alternate planet. Here's the really interesting thing, Logos. What do all these reactionary regimes we've been discussing have in common? Russia, China, and Vietnam. They all lost to progressives. So how the freaking heck is this going to be an alternative to actually beat progressives?
It's not.
It's not. Like, what the heck? This has always driven me insane. All of these societies failed to successfully resist progressive influence. And they got taken over by
the right side of history, Todd.
Right. Well, whatever. Yeah, again, I think Moldbug is a glow up in order to get the right to behave in the most stupid way possible to lose. What do you think, Logos?
Sorry, I missed that. What are you thinking about what?
I think, okay, I'll restate what I said. I think Moldbug is a glow up. We know he's connected to the CFR, in not directly but indirectly through his relatives, to give is like the worst possible advice to the right so that they lose.
Oh yeah, you talked about this like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago after that interview, and I agreed with it then. So
right, but like this whole like fetishizing of reactionaries, yeah, they lost, and if you fetishize the losers, guess what, Logos, you'll lose too.
It's almost like insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Right. No, I think they're still crazy, but at least what do I want to call these people? The Patriot, Merca, Militia, 1776 bros. Well, America won the Revolutionary War, so that's at least a model that could, in theory, work again.
Yeah, kinda.
In theory.
In theory.
Right, because even in theory, the reactionaries can't win again.
Right.
That's the point. The pattern repeated itself across most of the planet. An ally was a good ally for state, so long as it was not reactionary and corrupt. An ally of the Pentagon. The more nationalist, socialist, and violent, however, the better. For some reason, it was important for WashCorp to have more allies in more places than Sovietsky Soyuz, and these three factions, the Pentagon, State, and Soviet, competed for the privilege of funneling money and weapons to the murderous and criminally mismanaged Third World Sovcorps that emerged from the post-war destruction of Europe, European law, and order in most of Africa and Asia. Tens of millions of people were killed and billions left destitute in this new imperial scramble, which is still described today as liberation and independence of the Third World. Apparently, liberation requires the rule of Sovcorps, whose managers have the right skin color, and independence involves receiving billions of dollars a year in aid. The so-called conservative strategy, in which confused, half-brainwashed middlers attempted to revolt against the coaster departments of WashCorp through aggressive military provocations overseas, which, if victorious, would strengthen Midlander politicians in the Midler-dominated armed forces, now mercifully relieved of slave troops. After a few minor successes in the 1980s and 90s, found a tragic yet blackly comical Waterloo in Iraq. After a spectacular attack by National Socialist Neo-Islamic terrorists on New York. Wow, that is just so ridiculous. That is such a ridiculous description of Osama bin Laden and his plan. I mean, when you think of Osama bin Laden, don't you just think of like National Socialist logos?
No.
I know, it's so stupid. It's just another word salad.
Yeah.
Plainlanders became vehemently, if temporarily, done with the systematic adoration of any third world thug whose only saving grace was to be an enemy of the Pentagon. Coasters found it impossible to prevent the Pentagon's invasion of Iraq, whose ruling Sovcorp Bathco had done an exceptionally poor job of maintaining its membership as a State Department client. Instead, Bathco had cultivated the Europeans, leaving 2 degrees of separation between itself and the state. 2 turned out to be 1 too many. The invasion of Iraq was a smashing military success, but it was a tactical success and a strategic defeat, because the tremendous political power of the 21st century progressivism left the Pentagon with no viable options. It could not rule Iraq as a possession, as Arthur MacArthur had in the Philippines. It could not govern Iraq as a subjugated enemy like his son in Japan. It could not restore a monarchy as Kermit Roosevelt had in Iran. It could not even install one of its patent reactionary corrupt dictators like Chiang or Diem or Sigmund Rhee. No, the same military force that subjugated the south of Playland itself and ruled it under the Labor Code, which let it shoot any uniformless combatant without a trial, that under the same code invaded the Philippines and turned it into one of the most famously pro-Watch Corp states outside of Playland itself, that obliterated Germany and Japan from the air, killing 1 million civilians, and reconstructed them as a pacifist communes under the notorious JCS 1067, could only execute a policy of militarily absurd plan, which instead of democratic soft core, using proportional representation of all systems, promised to leave as soon as the ballots were dry and bound itself to obey rules of engagement, probably insufficient to impose order in Newark, New Jersey. It might as well have issued every Iraqi with an AK-47, an RPG, and 3 IEDs, and ordered everyone to join a paramilitary gang as soon as possible, winners to be selected by whatever prowess they could demonstrate in killing Planlanders. While this strategy was certainly well designed for coaster factions to prevent a military and hence Middler victory, it was not exactly designed to make WatchCorp popular among Middlers, as if they didn't love it already. And with the security... So these are the Hobbits, right, Logos? These are the Hobbits before the Hobbits, right?
I guess so.
The Hobbits. I'm just going to say Hobbits from now on. And if they didn't love it already, and with its security forces essentially in the hands of its enemies, WatchCorp faces a difficult political struggle. As its educational system becomes increasingly stagnant and moribund, in calculating at least as much apathy as loyalty, its natural evolution would be to transition from eudocracy to securocracy, but its own military caste despises it profoundly. What is he talking about? They of course use the security state. I mean, Bloomberg when was stop and frisk done in New York?
I think that's Giuliani.
But Bloomberg continued it. Remember, because when he ran,
yes,
and he pointed that out, and like all of these progressives were like, "Oh, Bloomberg's not supposed to say that. We're just going to have to like cover for him."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, of course, that was so. Giuliani was what, the 80s?
I think he was governor during September 11th.
Oh, that's right. So, whatever. And then, of course, this all becomes very clear with Occupy Wall Street. I think then Bloomberg was in charge. The only way to keep them in check is more democracy, which means extending the franchise, which, since the entire framework of nationalism depends on the identity between geography, Sovcorp, and population, and the ideal solution of letting actual Europeans vote in WatchCorp elections is simply beyond reach, means importing more and more Beringian voters from Mexico, while reducing the power of the White House. No Democrat has won the Euro Planelander presidential vote since Lyndon Johnson. Oh, I should have said Hobbits. Has won the Euro Hobbit vote in favor of that of Congress, which through seniority and gerrymandering has achieved the ideal universalist combination of democratic legitimacy and civil service stability, as demonstrated by its approval ratings, which seem to hover barely in the double digits without any degradation of power. Whereas if a president has an 11% rating, not even his hairdresser will do his comb over the way he asks. Now that the last strategy, which seemed to offer some hope to hobbits, invading the world and restoring Western civilization to places from which it has spent the last 100 years evaporating, is off the table, the evolutionary path of WatchCorp seems obvious. Until such a time as its creditors tire of loaning it another $1 trillion every year, it will join Eurocorp in its gradual process toward becoming bureaucratic. Brezhnevian Bemenstadt. As in Europe, the distinction between working as a direct employee of WatchCorp and for a private company will become increasingly irrelevant as companies become branded financially independent arms of the state in which the entire process of production is digitally regulated. a la ISO 9000 or Starbucks. Wait, no. So no, it's not. It's not that the state. It's not that the actual thing that's going on is that the state is in the pocket of the corporations. It's these poor put upon corporations in the pocket of the state, logos.
That's hilarious.
Like, oh my gosh, that's just so bad. I can't even. So this is WashCorp. Hope I've covered the major points. Hopefully, for any missing details, it should be reasonably easy to translate the official story to fit with the above. The official story is almost never wrong as a matter of fact. It usually is just interpretation. Of course, even this jaundiced and decidedly unofficial biography of WashCorp is an accurate perspective. Hume's Ought does not entitle us to claim that WashCorp is evil. Still less are we left with any idea of what to do about it if it is. I don't know. Why do Thomas like this Humean, logos?
What was that? I didn't hear the very last thing you said.
I said, why do Thomists like this Humean?
Oh, okay. I was gonna say what? I don't know. If I knew how or why Thomas did anything they did, I wouldn't think they were so crazy.
However, there are still some interesting observations we can make. The first observation is that the employees of WashCorp are overwhelmingly universalist, except for the disgruntled military. The second is that WashCorpers think of their employees as fundamentally charitable, i.e., elementary institution. It's not just that WashCorp has Google's motto, don't be evil. The point is so obvious that to state it is to sully it. The meaning of WashCorp is that WashCorp does good. Not just for Plainland, of course, but for the whole world, because universalists do not, of course, value hobbits over any other neo-hominids, and WashCorpers are universalists, so good to WashCorp is universalist good. The archaic legacy policies and procedures that WashCorp use to discriminate in favor of hobbits are distasteful and detestable and should be discarded as fast as possible. Ideally, WashCorp itself would become an unimportant unit of a single world South Corp. The third is that even though the source of WashCorp's fundamental goodness is its connection to public opinion, which can never be misguided or evil, there is still a way to evaluate WashCorp without reference to the cult of democracy. Democracy, like the principle of divine right, legitimates WashCorp's ownership of Plainland. To a good universalist, the only way in which WashCorp can be evil is if it abandons democracy, in which case it can no longer legitimate and should be treated as a tyrannical dictatorship. Until then, it is good, etc. A formalist, however, can duck this entire trap. A formalist has no interest at all in WashCorp's political formula, so does not care about whether WashCorp's democracy is a good democracy, bad democracy, or no democracy at all. To her, WashCorp simply owns Plainland. There is no why. Ownership is demonstrated by unchallenged control. WashCorp has it. Perhaps some debate is possible over what other parts of the world WashCorp owns. As far as Plainland goes, it's a no-brainer. The formalist, therefore, judges WashCorp only by its actions. She can say, why does WashCorp do X or Y? Why do the people involved with WashCorp act in ways that lead it to do X or Y? Why would it be better, in her opinion, if it did Z instead? And granted that WashCorp is invincible and cannot be destroyed, how, if at all, can she act to help change it into something whose actions are more desirable? We'll cover this in Chapter 6, but essentially my view is that people who oppose WashCorp are simply barking up the wrong tree. It's not that WashCorp can't be defeated, it's that even trying to weaken it is a mistake. Weaken a SovCorp, make it less efficient, and it compensates by getting larger and more complex. Rather, I think the only way to fix WashCorp is to improve it out of existence. It needs to become so much more powerful and so much more efficient that it no longer exists as such, and this effort must not contradict universalism in any way, shape, or form. If this doesn't make any sense or strike you as possible, please be patient and stay tuned. Oh my gosh, that's insane. That makes the whole hobbits versus elves a lot more understandable. I mean, what do you have to say to that insanity, these last two paragraphs here?
People who oppose WashCorp are simply barking up the wrong tree. It's not just that WashCorp can't be defeated, it's that even trying to weaken it is a mistake. Well, I mean, that's basically his position on that recent interview.
Yeah.
Weaken a SovCorp, make it less efficient, and it compensates by getting larger and more complex. Yeah, but I mean, in economics, you can make a corporation so big and bloated that it basically crumbles. You can't really do that easily for a government either. I mean, I don't know. Rather, I think the only way to fix WashCorp is to improve it out of existence. and he's become so much more powerful and so much more efficient that no longer exists. What the heck is he talking about?
I don't know. Like, I don't know. It's insane.
I don't know about you, Todd, but whenever I've been at war with an enemy, I thought, the best way to beat them is to make them more efficient.
Yeah, I know. It's right out of Sun Tzu.
Right? That's what I was going to say. Yeah, I bet it's in Sun Tzu somewhere.
dude, this guy is absolutely insane.
I mean, what was that? Was that famous thing that Sun Tzu said? Never interrupt your enemy when they are being inefficient, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, How Dawkins Caught Pwned is one of his most famous series. This is awful.
This is awful.
This is chapters. The 2 chapters we read today, 4 and 5, were absolutely awful. How does this have the reputation that it does?
I don't understand.
I mean, Moldbug is basically saying, okay, hobbits, stay home, don't do anything. I'm just going to go make the state that's ruining your life a lot more powerful, so that I can win.
It's also the same rant that he already went on and has been going on. The connection to Dawkins is very, very tenuous. Where there was supposed to be a connection to Dawkins about memes being parasitic, unhelpful to the hosts, and so on and so forth, haven't really been mentioned. It's like, yeah, people have died post-World War II when the U.S. have installed dictators and stuff like that, but it's like, look, as Steven Pinker and a bunch of other people have been pointing out, global standards of living are great. Technology is great. We're all making progress. Let's be on the right side of history. I mean, as long as you've got this march going on, there's nothing you can do. So any argument he has this is parasitic has just gone out the window.
Yeah, well, and of course he admits, right? Chapter 4, he said, yeah, we still have smartphones. Everything's great.
Yep.
I'll just go back to chapter 4, where he says, here we go, look at this. This is it. Look, this is what you're talking about, Logos, right here.
Technology is moving along pretty well. Moore's Law continues to zoom along. Fast computers, fancy mobile phones, blah, 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 blah.
Everything is fine.
Exactly. Yeah, so how can you argue that this universalist meme is parasitic and a harbinger of decay when society just seems to be plugging along and getting better and better all the time? That's talking at both sides of your mouth and people know it.
Yeah, well, okay. Now, obviously, I didn't read Moldbug, okay? Everything Moldbug said recently, in the last 2 years, on his Grey Mirror and with Oren McIntyre, he said in 2007. Why is anybody surprised if they allegedly read Moldbug?
Yeah. Like, I mean, people are reacting to Moldbug's interview. So there are 3 things that they were reacted to. There was the analogy. There was the comments he made about Roe and the Dobbs decision. And there was one more thing where he basically said like something like, if you defeat your enemy, you lose, or something like that people are paraphrasing in a context or whatever and having a go at, right? But yeah, all 3 of these things have been in there since the beginning. And so all these people who are supposedly big Moldbug fans freaking out about what he's just said, they're just showing they never read the guy, basically.
Yeah. Well, Logos, what you and I do, whether it's our church history series, whether it's Moldbug, nobody actually reads. Just nobody reads.
Yeah.
And they like a guy, whether it's, Augustine or Aquinas or Moldbug, and they never actually read what they said.
Yeah, and that's a big problem for me too, because I'll be debating people about stuff, philosophy, politics, whatever, and they'll recommend some kind of a book. It's like, well, if we'll only read this book, or if we'll only read this article, it'll address your concern. So I actually read the book article, and I get mad. I spend like 4 hours of my time combing through this thing, trying to figure out where it addresses my central claim. And half the time it doesn't. Another third of the time, it gets close. And a sixth of the time, it tries and it fails. I've heard the response somewhere else or something. And it's like, people don't even read the articles they recommend that I read. And so I have to waste a bunch of my time. It's just awful.
Well, yeah. And again, a lot of these people that liked Moldbug, now I didn't even read them until now because I didn't like them.
Right.
They shouldn't be surprised that he's saying what he's saying now.
No.
So why is everybody surprised? I mean, how does this happen? How do you generate a following with nobody who actually reads your blog? they get surprised when you say stuff that you've been saying for 16 years.
Well, because there's certain sound bites they like that they latch onto. And they're so devious that they look like they're in the know if they know, like, oh, there's this Moldbug guy and there's these sound bites. They have these little, like, dog whistle phrases they say to each other. That's all they need. They just need a bare minimum. And there it is.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah, yeah. The other thing too, I think I also know why a lot of these, a lot of the people that like Moldbug are engineers and computer programmers, and not only does he use a lot of computer code speak, he uses a lot of biology speak, right? Because memes and viruses and it's an effective. Well, you see, this is actually the joke, right? This is the joke. All of this is very modernist, very progressive, very optimistic because it's based on a certain understanding of technology.
Yep.
And all of Moldbug's followers, like him, are LARPing as reactionaries when they're actually futurist utopians. It's crazy. I mean, we're sort of dancing around this guy, but I mean, it's Spring Up Dave. Dave opposed what Moldbug said, but Moldbug was, on Lauren McIntyre and on the Grime Mirror, but he said this in 2007.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to grill on Dave too hard, but I've already said my frustrations about your discussion with Dave on Charlie's stream. It's really, really difficult to figure out exactly how Dave's using Moldbug when Dave's referring to his own, quote, charitable reading of what Moldbug has said, without appealing to the text about what Mold did in fact actually say. That's a problem.
I just thought of something. This is basically the distinction between a Protestant mind and a Catholic mind. Protestants are going to be, we got to read the text of Scripture. So if you want to know what Moldbug says, you got to read the text of Moldbug.
Right.
And then you don't have this built-in charity mechanism. You have to, whereas, a Catholic, no, we're not going to comb through the text of Scripture. We're just going to take it as received. And if it's an authority you like, you'll go out of your way to defend it, to protect it, to give it the benefit of the doubt. And I really do think it's a different way of looking at the world, the Protestant lens versus the Catholic lens.
Yeah, well, I mean, to steel man it, it's almost like there are people who read Moldbug initially and pulled other people into Moldbug. And they had an interpretation of Moldbug they took for themselves. And it's almost like a very particular interpretation about what Moldbug has said is clouded. There's whole traditions that are established about these things. And so the tradition of Moldbug is, in some sense, has outgrown its text. And so you can't even figure out what people who like Moldbug take Moldbug to mean outside of all this decades of tradition at this point that have gone into interpreting what he said. So
right.
If we're starting from the text, but we have no idea what the people who've read and reread and debated about Moldbug have said and established a tradition around, we're kind of shouting into the void. It's just pointless.
Wait, what we're doing is pointless, or what they're doing is pointless?
Well, there's no way to bridge the two. Let's just put it that way. I mean, if
well, yeah, there's no way to bridge the two, but again, right? So the way Moldbug is being handled is it's very rabbinical and Talmudic, right?
Right.
The Talmud is the commentary of rabbis on the Torah, and we see a similar reading of the Scripture within the Catholic tradition. And so this sort of Moldbugian group reads texts like rabbis and the clergy of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, eventually the commentary starts replacing the text.
Yeah. And so they get shocked when Moldbug says what he's been saying all along, because they, got too far up their own backside with their own commentary.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually this what we're doing demonstrates the practical utility of the Latin phrase of the Reformers, ad fontes, back to the sources.
Yep.
You end up in real time getting shocked by somebody who's saying something he's been saying for 16 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we're gonna look at the methodological difference, And again, this isn't to pick on Dave. It's just that he's someone who has a long reputation of being a Moldbug supporter. But all of Moldbug supporters are like this.
Mm-hmm.
And like this is just and we've seen this with reading the church fathers in our series, is these accumulated traditions and commentaries on what was said are often diametrically opposed to what was actually said.
Mm-hmm. I mean, starting with little things in the Old Testament and stuff with Justin, but it's only going to get worse and worse and worse as we go along. But then what ends up happening is people take these church fathers, these authoritative figures in their commentary as shorthand. It's like, oh, these smart people, they read the text, they're giving commentary on it. I'll just take the low resolution model about the commentary and just move along with that. Good enough for me. But eventually things just go wrong.
Right. And actually, it's funny, right? The entire world order that we're in now, that's collapsing around us, that Moldbug is reacting against, sort of. Those people make exactly the same claims. Oh, of course, progressivism is true. I mean, all these really smart people taught it. I'm not going to read everything that they said. Margaret Sanger says all sorts of crazy things. Human weeds have to be exterminated. No one's going to read her saying that.
Mm-hmm.
Or that her flagship, the American Birth Control, well, it's Planned Parenthood now, but I think it was the American Birth Control Review up until like 1945, collaborated with Nazi race scientists. I mean, they wrote articles for eugenics in her work. But of course, we're not going to actually read and see what Margaret Sanger did. We're going to get this highly distillated form of like female empowerment and liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this shorthand, and so it's funny, right? These reactionaries who are pushing back, quote unquote, against the system are thinking just like they're interacting with the text, the material, the objective facts in the world in exactly the same way as the NPC normies are.
Right.
By just looking for these, bite-sized distillations rather than going through the hard work. I mean, under normal circumstances, I suppose you should be able to trust authority figures, but we very clearly don't live in ordinary circumstances. So when are people just going to wake up?
Never, because the entire point of authority figures is to save them time, because time is a scarce and valuable resource. And as long as the function needs to exist, i.e., smart people look into complicated things, tell us what's what, so we can save time and move on with our lives, focus on our lives and our kids. As long as that function needs to be met, they're going to default to any institutions that claim to fit the bill. It's all they can do.
Well, yeah, but like at a certain point, right, you're going to have to pivot to authority figures that are informal because they actually know what's going on.
Yeah, they'll have to pivot from one set of authority figures to another set of authority figures. That's true, and that's when the conflict's really going to happen.
Well, that's what I'm talking about, right?
Oh, okay, yeah.
So for example, I'm an informal authority figure, but I've done all the legwork on all these things. Now, right now, I guess people can still pretend things are going well enough that they don't feel the need to listen. But I feel like at some point, those two lines on the graph are going to cross. And the fact that, people like you and I don't have the cred, quote unquote, the cred, won't matter because we will be able to deliver results.
Well, our biggest problem is marketing. I mean, very few people know who we are, and that's fine. But
well, that wasn't my problem 16 years ago when the system spit me out. But that was where, yeah, that's our problem now. But that wasn't the problem back then.
Well, the entire point of formally working your way through the system and being a quote authority figure is that PhD in front of your name gives you access to a large swath of marketing. That's the biggest barrier from informal to formal authority figure.
Right, in the modern age, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
and so once that threshold is crossed, that's when the two lines will be crossed. Is when it's easy enough to market people who don't have the credentials, and people can find them and access them, and then they want to. Once all those things happen, then you can start seeing it.
All right. Yeah. All right. So I think we did come to a lot of interesting conclusions and realizations, even though Moldbug is all over the place. Is there anything that you want to add before we wrap up, Logos?
No, it seems to be about the same realizations we've been coming to over the last few weeks, to be honest.
Well, yeah, but I'm talking more like the methodology of reading.
Yeah.
That was kind of a new insight, I think.
Hmm.
So the moral of the story is, kids, don't be like Catholics. Actually read the text. It's Ty
Mm.
Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.